Welcome back to another story on Marvel Harry. This time, we're bringing you, what if Thor found baby Harry at Godric's Hollow and raised him in Asgard as god of thunder and magic? Your likes fuel our creativity. Subscribe and stay tuned. Here's the story. Chapter 1, The Boy in the Embers. The village of Godric's Hollow was the kind of quiet that felt wrong. Thor had walked enough battlefields to know the difference between peaceful silence and the silence that follows something terrible. This was the second kind. The air tasted of ash and ozone and something older, something that prickled at the back of his neck the way Darkseer sometimes did when Loki was in a particularly creative mood. Except this wasn't Loki's magic. This was rawer. More desperate. The kind of power that gets wrung out of a person at the very end of everything. He hadn't meant to stop here. He'd been traveling the lower realms on foot, or rather, on cloud and wind, trying to clear his head after the argument with his father. The details of the argument barely mattered now. Something about responsibility, something about proving himself, the usual Odin lecture delivered with the usual Odin gravitas, and Thor had stormed out of the throne room with Mjolnir swinging and his temper running hot. He'd crossed the Bifrost without even telling Heimdall where he was going, which had earned him exactly the expression from the gatekeeper that he deserved. Midgard had seemed like a reasonable destination. He liked Midgard. The mortals were interesting. Their food was good, their wars were small but passionate, and no one expected a prince of Asgard to sit quietly at a feast table and discuss political marriages. He'd been drifting over the English countryside, enjoying the cold November air, when the feeling had hit him. Not a sound. Not a sight. Just a pull, like a hook somewhere behind his sternum, drawing him down and west toward a cluster of lights that turned out to be a small village wrapped in frost and sleep. And then he'd seen the house. What was left of it, anyway? One wall was entirely gone, blasted outward into the yard. The roof had caved in on the upper story. Smoke still curled from the wreckage, lazy and gray in the moonlight, and scattered across the frost-stiff grass were the kind of objects that only told a story through their brokenness: a smashed picture frame, a child's toy broom snapped clean in half, a woman's shoe lying alone by the garden gate. Thor landed quietly, which was not something he was known for. His boots touched the earth and he stood still for a moment, listening. The street beyond was empty. Curtains twitched in distant windows but no one came out. Whatever had happened here, the neighbors were pretending they hadn't noticed, which told him more than enough about how afraid they were. He stepped through the gap where the wall had been. The inside of the house was worse. The stairs had partially collapsed. There was a dark stain on the hallway floor that Thor didn't look at for long. He moved through what had been a sitting room, stepping over debris, and it was there that his eyes landed on the only thing in the ruin that was not broken. A woman. She was lying at the foot of what had been a staircase, red hair spread across the floor, her arms still slightly curved, the shape of someone who had been holding something. She was gone. He could see that immediately. Whatever she had been holding was not there anymore, but the position of her arms, that final curled embrace, told him exactly what the last thing she had done was. Thor stood there for a moment. He had seen death in battle 1,000 times. He had held dying warriors, had carried friends from fields of blood and ruin. But there was something about this particular silence, this particular woman lying alone in a ruined house, that settled into him differently. He removed his cape and laid it over her. It was a small thing. It was all he could do. He turned to go, and heard a sound. Not crying. That was the thing that stopped him. A child that had been through what this house had clearly been through should have been screaming fit to raise the dead. Instead, the sound he heard was something between a gurgle and a laugh. Pure and absurd and entirely out of place, drifting down from what remained of the upper floor. Thor looked at the collapsed staircase, calculated, and simply flew up through the gaping hole in the ceiling. The upper room, a nursery, he realized, from the pale yellow walls and the painted moons and stars, many of which were now scorched black, had a single crib standing in the far corner. The crib should not have been standing. The wall behind it was rubble. The floor around it was charred in a pattern that radiated outward like a starburst, as if something immense had exploded from the crib rather than at it. But the crib itself was untouched. Not a scratch on the white-painted wood. Sitting in the crib, surrounded by floating embers that he was treating like toys, was a baby. 11 months old, maybe. Dark hair that stuck out in 17 directions and showed no interest in being anything else. Chubby fists batting at the glowing embers, which spun obligingly around him like planets in orbit, like they were playing with him. Every time he touched one it didn't burn him, it flared a little brighter, pulsed, and drifted to a new position. The child noticed Thor. He looked up with eyes the color of new leaves, went very still for approximately 1 second, and then raised both arms with an expression of absolute imperial command that would not have looked out of place on Odin's own face. Thor stared. The embers kept spinning. Thor said. The child made a noise that was clearly well. Are you going to pick me up or not? And reached both hands higher. Thor crossed the room, stepping over scorched debris, and looked down at the child for a long moment. There was a scar on the boy's forehead, fresh, livid, shaped like a bolt of lightning. That stopped him. He leaned in slightly, and the magic he felt radiating from that scar, from this child, from the very pattern of the char on the floor, slid over his skin like something alive. Dark magic, yes. But beneath it, or perhaps through it, something else entirely. Something ancient. Something that did not belong to any tradition he had ever felt in Asgard or in any of the 9 realms he traveled. It was old. Older than he could account for. And it was wound all through this child like gold thread through dark cloth. The baby grabbed his finger. Thor had enormous hands. The boy's entire fist barely wrapped around one finger, but he gripped it with a sureness that was frankly alarming, and he looked up at Thor with those green eyes and made a small decisive sound, as if he had made up his mind about something. Who left you here? Thor murmured, mostly to himself. The embers drifted around them both. One landed on the back of Thor's hand and faded out without leaving a mark, as if the child had decided the game was over. Thor stood up with the boy in his arms. He didn't think about it particularly hard. The decision made itself, the way certain decisions do, not through deliberation but through the simple impossibility of any other choice. There was a dead woman downstairs who had died making the shape of a person holding a child. There was a ruined house and a scorched floor and a scar on a baby's head that spoke of violence aimed specifically at this child. There was no one in the silent village who had come out to help, and that meant there was no one here who was going to. He was not leaving a child in rubble. He did look around the room before he left. On the floor, half-burned, was a scrap of parchment with handwriting on it. He picked it up. Most of it was ash, but one corner survived. Take care of our Harry. We love you. The name at the bottom was gone. Harry. He looked at the boy. The boy looked at him with absolutely sovereign self-possession for someone who was approximately the size of Thor's forearm. Harry, Thor said, testing it. The child said something that sounded like BA but with enthusiasm. A fine answer, Thor said. He tucked the scrap of parchment into his belt. Then he held the boy close, feeling him warm and impossibly alive against his chest, and he called Mjolnir to his free hand and stepped out through the ruined wall into the night. He rose without haste, angling north and east, the English countryside spreading out beneath him, the November stars enormous overhead. The child didn't cry. He pressed his face against Thor's chest and curled his fists in the fabric of his shirt and went to sleep with a speed and completeness that Thor, who had spent considerable time being impressed by warriors, found genuinely impressive. He flew through the dark toward where Heimdall would be watching, because Heimdall was always watching, and he already knew what the gatekeeper was going to say. Heimdall said nothing. That was somehow worse. The Bifrost observatory was all crystal and light, the bridge extending out into the infinite dark of space, and Heimdall stood at his post with his great sword planted before him and his golden eyes fixed on Thor the way they had been fixed on Thor, presumably, since before the boy in his arms was born. Those eyes dropped to Harry for exactly 2 seconds. "Welcome back, my prince," Heimdall said. "I found him in Midgard," Thor said. "Not a justification. A fact. I know. His mother is dead. I don't know where his father is." Thor paused. "His father may also be dead." Heimdall was quiet for a moment. "There are people on Midgard asking questions about the child. They have been since last night." "What sort of people?" "The kind with long cloaks and wands, who refer to themselves as wizards." A pause. "One of them is quite powerful. He has been to the house already." "And yet," Thor said carefully, "the child was still there when I arrived." "Yes," Heimdall said, and his expression did not change, but something in his voice did. "He was." Thor looked down at Harry, who slept on with the uncomplicated confidence of someone who had already decided where he belonged. "Then I'll let those people know he's safe." "You could do that," Heimdall agreed. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I am not giving him back to a world that left him in rubble," Thor said. "No," Heimdall said. "I didn't imagine you would." He stepped aside from the mechanism that activated the Bifrost. "Your father is going to be very unhappy with you." "My father is always unhappy with me for something," Thor said. He stepped forward. "At least this time I'm certain I'm right." The Bifrost took them both, the Thunder God and the sleeping child, in a column of light that split the night sky over England like a second lightning strike, and they were gone. Odin Allfather, king of Asgard, had ruled 9 realms for longer than most civilizations had existed. He had fought wars that reshaped the universe. He had made decisions that cost him an eye, a son, a wife's patience, and occasionally his supper. He was not a man who was easily surprised. He was surprised. "You brought a what from Midgard?" "A child, father." Thor stood in the center of the throne room with the boy on his hip, which was not the dignified posture the throne room usually inspired, but he'd learned from raising the posture of dignity with Mjolnir available, and a child on one arm was almost exactly as effective. "His name is Harry." Odin came down the steps of the dais, slowly, and Thor held his ground. Frigga, seated to the right, had gone completely still with an expression that was doing several things at once: surprise, concern, and something else that Thor recognized as the look she got when she was already deciding something and hadn't told anyone yet. The Allfather stopped before them and looked at the boy. Harry, for his part, stared back at Odin with those green eyes and did not look remotely intimidated by the eye patch, the grey beard, the ravens, or the weight of millennia radiating off the king of the gods. He pointed one finger at Odin's eye patch, expression intent. "Don't," Thor said quietly. Harry did not point any further but maintained clear interest. Odin was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower. "Where did you find him?" "A ruined house in Midgard. His mother had died protecting him. There was dark magic all through the place, powerful, but not any tradition I recognize. It didn't feel Asgardian, didn't feel like anything from the other realms. And yet the boy is," Thor paused. "He was playing with burning embers, father. They moved for him. Orbited him like planets. He's 11 months old and the magic in that child is." "Show me his scar." Thor shifted Harry slightly. Frigga had come down from her seat now, moving with that particular quiet that meant she was done being an observer. She touched Harry's cheek briefly as she passed, and Harry grabbed her finger exactly the way he'd grabbed Thor's, with both hands this time, which suggested he was learning, and she made a sound low in her throat that Thor had not heard since he and Loki were very small. Odin examined the scar with his single eye narrowed and his hand raised, the way he looked at things with that second sight that went beyond physical vision. He was quiet for a long time. The ravens on his shoulders shifted. Harry watched them with the kind of absolute fascination that only very young children and very patient hunters bring to observation. "This was made by a killing curse," Odin said. "Is that Midgardian magic?" "The wizarding tradition, yes. Ancient. Separate from the seer we know in Asgard, though they share a common root, the way all languages share common sounds. He lowered his hand. This curse should have killed the child. It didn't. No. Odin's voice was very even. The mother's sacrifice created a protection. Old magic. One of the oldest, love as a counterspell. The death curse was reflected and broke apart against it. He paused. But that is not all that happened. Part of the curse rebounded. And part of it. He studied Harry with his ancient gaze. Remained. Remained, Thor repeated. There is power in this child that was not put there by his parentage alone. When the curse broke, it left something behind, a fragment of whatever being cast it. An echo of power. Odin stepped back. He survived because of his mother's love. But he is what he is in part because of what tried to kill him. The throne room was quiet. A log shifted in a brazier somewhere. Harry said "Bah" quite loudly, apparently done with being discussed while awake, and made another grab for Frigga's hand. He stays, Frigga said. Not a question. Odin looked at her. She looked back. Whatever passed between them in that look had the weight of thousands of years of marriage behind it, not an argument but an understanding, arrived at without words, the way certain agreements between people who know each other completely are made. Odin looked at Thor. This will be complicated, he said, in the tone of someone who has seen complicated coming from a considerable distance. Most good things are, Thor said. Another silence. Odin walked back toward his throne, slowly, his hand on Gungnir, and stopped at the foot of the steps. His back was to them. The boy will need a name that honors both what he is and what he will become. I thought, Thor said carefully, Harlan. Harlan Odinson. Harry, as his mother called him. A pause. Harlan, Odin said. He climbed the steps. See to it that he eats. He looks underfed. He sat on his throne and opened a scroll as though the matter was settled, which it was. That was how Odin accepted things, not with proclamation, but by simply no longer objecting. Thor had learned to read the difference years ago. Frigga took Harry from Thor's arms with the ease of someone who had raised 2 Asgardian princes and was not intimidated by the wriggling and the hair and the green eyes, and the way Harry settled against her was so immediate, so trusting, so complete, that something shifted in Thor's chest. Well then, little one, Frigga murmured, carrying him toward the corridor. Let's find you something to eat, and then we're going to have a proper look at what you're carrying in that small body of yours, and then, she glanced back at Thor over her shoulder, and she was smiling, not her court smile, but the real one, the one from when he and Loki were boys. Your father is going to have to explain you to Loki, and I intend to watch that conversation. Loki was in his chambers, surrounded by 3 different books and what appeared to be an ongoing experiment involving green fire and a captured shadow, when Thor knocked and opened the door simultaneously, which had been his standard approach to Loki's personal space for as long as Loki could remember and which had never once not been annoying. Thor, Loki said, without looking up. Whatever you broke, I didn't do it. I didn't break anything. That's new. He turned a page. The shadow in the jar flickered. I heard you came back from Midgard. Father's upset. Father accepted it. Which means he's upset and too tired to argue. Loki looked up for the first time, prepared to deliver a remark about Thor's perpetual chaos, and stopped. Thor was holding a child. Loki set the book down. He stood up. He crossed the room slowly, the way he moved when he was genuinely uncertain about something, which was rare enough to be notable, and stopped 2 feet away, looking at Harry. Harry looked back. Then, with the air of someone rendering judgment, he pointed at Loki. Loki blinked. Is that a scar? The shape of a lightning bolt, Thor said. From a killing curse. Killing curse, Loki repeated. His eyes moved from the scar to the boy's eyes to the strange, almost visible shimmer of energy that clung to Harry the way humidity clung to Midgardian mornings. Something changed in his expression, not quite awe, but the nearest thing to it that Loki's face typically allowed. Thor. This child is radiating magic. I know. Not Asgardian magic. Not any magic this is something else entirely. He reached out, and stopped himself. Then he looked at Harry with an expression Thor had seen exactly once before, when Loki was 6 years old and had found a wounded raven in the palace courtyard and spent 2 weeks nursing it back to health in secret before Frigga discovered it. He has 2 traditions of power in him. 2 separate systems of magic, tangled together. This one is something like what I know, seer adjacent, older, and this other. He almost touched the scar. This is darker. Something was trying to use him as a vessel and couldn't. Can you understand it? Eventually. Loki lowered his hand. Given time. Harry had been watching this examination with patient interest. Now, apparently deciding the assessment was complete, he reached out and grabbed a handful of Loki's dark hair. Loki went very still. He does that, Thor said, working hard at his expression. I can see that, Loki said carefully. Harry pulled with cheerful experimental force, which would have been painful from anyone with more muscle mass but at 11 months was merely impertinent. He has no concept of consequence. None whatsoever. Like someone else I raised alongside. Loki extricated his hair with a dignity that was only moderately dented, and Harry, finding this interesting, grabbed his finger instead. And here was the thing that Thor would remember for the rest of his very long life. Loki looked down at those small fingers wrapped around his and something in his face went quiet. Not soft, exactly. Quiet. Like a room where something has finally settled. Harlan, Thor said. That's his name. Harry, informally. Harry, Loki said, trying it. He looked at his brother. You're going to be a terrible father. Almost certainly. You have no patience for anything. I have plenty of patience. You once threw Mjolnir at a feast table because someone spilled your mead. That was years ago. It was last spring, Thor. The point, Thor said, is that he's here, and he's staying, and I'd like your help. Loki looked at Harry for a long moment. Harry was now attempting to put Loki's finger in his mouth, which Loki permitted with the air of someone making a calculated sacrifice. I'll teach him seer, Loki said at last. When he's old enough. Whatever tradition is in him, I'll learn it alongside him, and we'll work it out between us. I was hoping you'd say that. I know you were. Loki plucked his finger free and crossed back to his desk with the deliberate casualness of someone pretending they weren't moved. Now take the child to his room before he drools on my research. Thor took Harry back with a grin that he didn't bother hiding. Harry made a sound of mild protest and then decided against it, pressing his face into Thor's shoulder, eyes already getting heavy again. He'd had a very eventful night for someone who'd only been alive 11 months. Thor, Loki said, as his brother turned to leave. Yes. You did the right thing. A pause. A slight adjustment of tone, something Loki only did when he meant something completely and was uncomfortable with meaning it. Whoever left that child in a ruined house to manage on his own, they didn't deserve to keep him. Thor stood still for a moment. Then, no. They didn't. He carried Harry out into the golden corridor, and the door clicked shut behind him. The months that followed were the loudest Asgard had been in centuries, in an unexpected way. Not loud with battle or with ceremony, but with the particular loud noise at unexpected hours that accompanies having a small child somewhere in a palace. Harry was walking by the time he was 14 months, which Frigga said was early and Thor took as evidence of exceptional character. He was climbing by 15 months, which resulted in a famous incident involving the palace library's upper shelves, a considerable number of dislodged texts, and a small person sitting cheerfully amid the avalanche as though he'd arranged it that way. He spoke first in a mixture of English and the Asgardian tongue, which produced a dialect entirely his own, and he spoke constantly. He asked questions about everything with a relentless attention that made the palace scholars both delight in him and secretly fear what he'd be like once he could read. He called Thor Pabai, a mash of several things that had ended up there through linguistic evolution, and Frigga Mormor, and Odin, after considerable negotiation, grandfather, which Odin accepted with the careful dignity of someone who was absolutely moved and absolutely not going to show it. Loki he simply called Loki, from very early on, and with such precision and authority that Loki said it was the only name anyone in Asgard had ever said correctly, and he saw no reason to change the arrangement. The magic came in quickly and came in strange. By the time Harry was 3, objects moved when he wanted them to. By 4, he was unconsciously reshaping the air around him when he was very happy or very upset, the way Asgardian children with Seer sometimes did, but alongside it was this other thing, this raw, ancient force that didn't respond to Asgardian techniques at all. It was not Seer. It was something older and rougher and more instinctive, and it came from Harry's hands and his emotions and his will with a directness that actually made Loki sit quietly for several hours one afternoon, thinking. What Loki eventually concluded was that the magic Harry had inherited from his parents, from what Loki had slowly researched about the Midgardian wizarding tradition, was a system of structured, wand magic. The kind that needed a focus and a word and a specific intention. But Harry had never had a wand. He'd never had a teacher from that tradition. His inherited magic had grown up in Asgard, exposed to Seer from infancy, and rather than developing separately the two systems had braided together into something that neither tradition would have produced alone. He shouldn't be able to do this, Loki told Frigga one evening, both of them watching through a doorway as Harry, age 5, sat cross-legged on the nursery floor with a small ball of golden light between his hands that he was carefully teaching to change colors. The light was responding. Not metaphorically. Responding, shifting hue based on some exchange that appeared to be going both ways. This is Seer casting without the meditative training. He's doing it on instinct. Children sometimes do, Frigga said. Not like this. Asgardian children with power need years to achieve basic manifestation. Harry is 5 and he's having a conversation with a ball of energy that he made himself. Loki watched the ball turn a deep, pleased blue. It's the second system. They're reinforcing each other. The Midgardian magic is more instinctive, more directly connected to emotion and will. And it's teaching the Seer to respond the same way. Is that dangerous? Almost certainly, Loki said pleasantly. It's also unprecedented. And extraordinary. He paused. I need to start his formal training earlier than I'd planned. How much earlier? Yesterday, Loki said, and walked into the room, and sat down across from Harry, and said, show me what you're doing with the light, and that was where it began. Thor's training started differently. Harry was 7 when he first picked up a training weapon, a short wooden practice sword, sized for a child, and took to it with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he'd been waiting for this specifically. Thor had trained hundreds of warriors over the years, young Asgardians who came to him with varying degrees of natural ability, and he knew within the first 10 minutes of a new student which ones were going to be good and which ones were going to be great. Harry was different from both categories. He was fast. He was deceptively strong for his size. But more than that, he watched Thor's hands, his weight, his footwork, with that same green-eyed intensity he brought to everything, and then he adjusted. Within an hour he was anticipating corrections before Thor made them, not because he'd been trained to but because he was reading Thor the way Thor read a battlefield. You're quiet today, Thor said, during a break, offering Harry water. I'm thinking, Harry said, drinking. About the footwork? About how you always shift your weight before you go for the strong strike. Harry looked up. Your right shoulder drops. Just a little. But it does. Thor stared at him. Harry stared back. He was 7 years old and he had just correctly identified a tell that Thor had mostly corrected decades ago but apparently not entirely, because a 7-year-old had spotted it in an hour. Pick up your sword, Thor said. Harry's grin was the most Asgardian thing about him. By 10 he was sparring with warriors twice his size and winning a reasonable percentage of those bouts through a combination of speed, strategy, and what the warriors politely called unpredictability and what Thor privately called absolute chaos. He would fight traditional until his opponent was comfortable, then switch to something entirely different, using magic mid-bout, changing tactics so completely it was like fighting a different person, once during a training session making the entire floor slick with ice through some combination of sear and sheer wool that had even Loki raising an eyebrow from the sidelines. "That's not the exercise," Thor said, looking at the three warriors sitting on the ice. "No," Harry agreed. "But it worked. The exercise was footwork." "My footwork was great," Harry said. "So was everyone else's footwork until approximately 30 seconds ago, and then it became irrelevant." Thor opened his mouth. Closed it. Said, "You sound like your uncle." "Thank you," Harry said, in the exact tone that confirmed this was entirely intentional. At 8, Thor told him about his parents. He'd been preparing for the conversation for years, had talked with Frigga about how to do it, had genuinely lain awake turning over the words, and then Harry had come and sat next to him one evening at the edge of the palace balcony. They both liked evenings at the edge of the balcony, the one that looked out over the golden rooftops of Asgard toward the Bifrost observatory, and he'd said, quite calmly, "Will you tell me about where I came from?" Thor had said yes. And then he'd told him. Not all of it, not the darkest parts, not the details of the ruined house that Thor still dreamed about sometimes, but the true shape of it. A world called Midgard where there were people with magic like his, called wizards, who kept their world secret from ordinary people. His parents, James and Lily Potter, who had been that kind of people, and brave, and young, and who had died protecting him from something very dark. The scar on his forehead, what it meant. The choice Thor had made in the rubble. Harry listened without interrupting, which was not typical for Harry, and when Thor was done he was quiet for a while, looking out over the city. "Do you think they were good people?" he finally asked. "My parents. I think," Thor said, "that a woman who gives her life to protect her child is a person worth honoring." Harry sat with that. "And my father? I don't know enough about him. But he loved your mother, and they loved you, and they were fighting for something they believed in." Harry nodded slowly. "And the thing that killed them is not dead," Thor said, choosing honesty the way he always chose it, directly. "There are those in your birth world who believe it will return someday. They call you the boy who lived. They believe you're part of a prophecy about it." Harry looked at his hands. The scar on his forehead caught the golden light of Asgard's eternal late afternoon. "What do you believe?" he asked. Thor put a hand on his son's shoulder, not small anymore. 8-year-old Harry was wiry and tall for his age, but still small enough that Thor's hand covered most of his shoulder. "I believe that you are Harlan Odinson, Prince of Asgard, and that whatever comes for you will deeply regret it. Beyond that, I don't think prophecies get to decide what your life means. People do. You do." Harry was quiet for a moment longer. Then, "Do you think there's actually a magic school in England?" Thor blinked. "Possibly." "Why?" "Because Loki told me there was, and I want to see if British wizards are as dramatic as he made them sound." Thor stared at his son. His son grinned at him, and it was Lily Potter's mouth and James Potter's chaos and something that was entirely, irreducibly Harry, and Thor made a sound between a laugh and a sigh and said, "You are absolutely my child and I have no idea how that happened." "Training and example," Harry said. "Loki told me that too." The sun set over Asgard and they sat there together, the god of thunder and the boy he'd carried home from the rubble of someone else's tragedy, and the light was gold and warm and endless, and below them the city went about its eternal business, entirely unaware that somewhere in the country of England, a very old man with a very long plan was about to start wondering why his carefully placed letters were finding no address at all. It was Heimdall who first mentioned the owls. "They're going through the Bifrost," he said, when Harry was 10, which was the summer that Odin had finally agreed to let Harry join Thor on his travels through the realms, an agreement reached after approximately 14 months of campaign during which Harry had somehow recruited both Frigga and Loki to his side. Midgardian owls. From England specifically. They seem confused. Thor looked up from his meal. Confused? Owls of that tradition carry letters through magical means, Heimdall said. They are bound to find their recipient. These ones have been attempting to locate the boy for several weeks. They keep arriving at the edge of my sight, circling, finding the Bifrost, and getting rather lost. What letters? I can only see so much from here, my prince. But they are addressed to a Harlan Odinson, with the secondary address Asgard, the Golden Realm. Harry had walked in during this conversation, fresh from a morning session with Loki that had left a faint smell of ozone and pine smoke on his clothes. He stopped in the doorway, reading the room, and said, "Is this about the owls?" "You knew about the owls?" Thor asked. "Loki told me. He's been watching through his mirror for about 3 weeks. He thinks they're Hogwarts letters." Harry said the word with the comfort of someone who'd done research. "The wizarding school in Scotland." "You're 10, Thor said. Which is when they send the letters, apparently. You go at 11. Harry crossed the room and sat down beside his father in the easy way he had, sprawling slightly, the way Asgardian children sat with their parents, no formality in private, never. "Loki thinks I should go. He says it would be informative." "Loki thinks everything is informative. He's usually right." Thor looked at him. "Do you want to go?" Harry thought about it, not for long, because Harry rarely needed long when he'd already made up his mind. "I think," he said carefully, "that there's a whole part of where I come from that I've never seen. And I think there's something at that school that's connected to my parents and connected to whatever's going to come back someday, and I'd rather know about it than not." He paused. "Also, Loki said the British wizards have a game where they fly on brooms, and I would like to see if it's as embarrassing as it sounds." "There will be rules," Thor said. "There are always rules. Rules you'll need to follow. You'll be among children who know nothing of Asgard, nothing of Seer, nothing of Pabai," Harry said, with the patience of someone addressing a person they love who is being slightly silly. "I'm not going to hide what I am." "I know," Thor said. He'd known that since approximately the first hour of Harry's life. "I'm just saying that you'll need to be myself," Harry said. "Which I intend to be. And if that's too much for the British wizards, that's genuinely their problem." Thor looked at his son for a long moment. Green eyes. Lightning scar. The quiet confidence of someone who had been raised surrounded by gods and had concluded, accurately, that there was nothing fundamentally threatening about any room he was likely to walk into. He thought about a baby in a ruined house, batting at embers in the dark. "Let the owls through," he said to Heimdall. Heimdall nodded. "Already done, my prince." The first owl arrived 40 minutes later, landing on Harry's arm with the harassed dignity of a bird that had been trying to deliver a letter across interdimensional space for 3 weeks and was going to get its job done if it was the last thing it did. Harry took the envelope, read the address, which did indeed say Asgard, the Golden Realm, in a way that suggested someone with a remarkable amount of information and not quite enough of it, and opened it with the calm efficiency of someone who had been expecting exactly this. He read it once. Then he handed it to Thor. Thor read it. He read it again. He handed it back. "September the 1st, Harry said. Platform 9 3/4. He tucked the letter inside his jacket. "Loki is going to love explaining that to me." "Loki," Thor said, "is going to insist on coming with us to the station." "Obviously," Harry said. He was already heading for the door. "I need to go tell him the owls worked." He wagered with Sif that they'd give up by the end of the month. He was gone in the particular way he went, quickly, not running but moving as though standing still was mildly offensive, and Thor sat alone in the room with the last of his morning meal and the sound of owls somewhere in the corridor and the knowledge, warm and complete, that whatever was coming for his son in the world of wizards and prophecies and old dark things, it had no idea what it had asked for. The thunder god smiled, and reached for his ale, and was in considerably good spirits for the rest of the day. Chapter 2, Prince of Two Storms. The summer Harry turned 10 was, by general Asgardian consensus, the loudest summer the palace had seen in living memory. This was not entirely Harry's fault. Some of it was Thor, who had decided that his son's pre-Hogwarts training needed to be accelerated, and whose idea of acceleration involved sparring sessions that started at dawn and ended when one of them was significantly winded. Some of it was Loki, who had moved his research entirely into Harry's training space, a large stone courtyard off the east wing that had been repurposed 3 years ago from a disused guard station, and who treated every session as an opportunity to test increasingly elaborate theories about the intersection of seer and what he'd taken to calling wandless wizardry, which was not quite accurate but was the closest Asgardian terminology had. And some of it, genuinely, was Harry himself, who had recently discovered that the two magical systems he carried responded to each other in ways that produced effects neither system should have been capable of alone, and who was therefore in a state of permanent enthusiastic experimentation that had already resulted in 2 singed walls, 1 very surprised raven, and a fountain in the east courtyard that now ran gold every third Tuesday for reasons no one had satisfactorily explained. But the summer was also something quieter underneath all of that, because Harry knew, they all knew, that September was coming, and that everything was going to change after it. He wasn't afraid of that. Fear wasn't really the shape of what he felt about Hogwarts. It was more like the feeling before a particularly good fight, when you didn't know exactly what you were walking into but you knew you were ready for most of it, and the parts you weren't ready for were going to be interesting. Loki had spent the better part of 3 months preparing him, which with Loki meant less here are facts about the school and more here is the complete geopolitical history of the wizarding world and its relationship to itself, and also here is everything I have been able to observe through my mirror about the current state of affairs and the people running the institution you are about to attend. Loki's information gathering was thorough to the point of being slightly alarming. The headmaster is named Albus Dumbledore, Loki said one morning, seated across from Harry in the training courtyard with a cup of something hot and several open books around him, the way he arranged himself when he was settled in for a long session. He is considered the greatest wizard of his age. Powerful, politically influential, and possessed of a reputation that has been very carefully constructed over a very long career. Harry was doing handstand push-ups against the courtyard wall. You say carefully constructed like it's a warning. Everything I say is a warning. That's why you should listen more carefully. Loki turned a page. He knew your parents. He was, in fact, central to the events that led to their deaths, in that he placed them under a protection called the Fidelius Charm, which was meant to keep their location secret. Harry came down from the handstand, rolled to his feet. It didn't work. No. Someone they trusted told their secret to the thing that killed them. A pause. Dumbledore placed you with a family after that night. Your mother's sister and her husband. Mortals, no magic. He left you on a doorstep in November. Harry went still. He'd known the broad shape of this. Thor had told him, years ago, that there had been people in his birth world who'd looked for him that night. But the specifics were new. A doorstep, he said flatly. With a letter of explanation. A letter. He believed it was for the best, Loki said, with the particular careful neutrality he used when he had opinions he was choosing to deliver obliquely. He had plans for you. The prophecy about Voldemort, yes, I know the name, I refuse to be theatrically afraid of syllables, specified that only you could defeat him. Dumbledore's intention was that you would grow up in the Muggle world, hidden, experiencing hardship, and arrive at Hogwarts appropriately humble and grateful and malleable. Harry looked at him for a long moment. You're telling me he left me on a doorstep in November so I'd grow up malleable? Among other reasons. And then Thor showed up instead. And then your father showed up instead, Loki agreed, the neutrality slipping just enough to let a fraction of satisfaction through. Which I imagine has been quietly devastating to whatever timeline the old man had planned. He closed one book and opened another. I thought you should know this before you walked into his school. Harry was quiet for a moment, turning it over. Then, is he evil? Loki considered this seriously, the way he considered everything seriously underneath the performance of ease. No, he said finally. I think he genuinely believes he is doing what is necessary. He is a man who decided a long time ago that the shape of certain outcomes was worth the cost and individual suffering, and then spent so long maintaining that decision that he forgot to question it. A pause. That is, in some ways, more dangerous than evil. Evil you can fight directly. Harry absorbed this. He sat down across from Loki and picked up one of the open books. His reading of both English and Asgardian script was excellent. Frigga had taught him young, and looked at it without really reading it. He doesn't know what I am, Harry said. He suspects something happened that night in Godric's Hollow, but not the truth of it. His information network on Asgard is precisely as good as it sounds. Loki's tone suggested this was not very good. He knows you're alive, or he should, by now, if the owl situation gave him any information, and that you're not at your aunt and uncle's home, and that you're apparently attending Hogwarts from an address that has never appeared in any Muggle atlas. What do you think he'll do? Watch, Loki said. He'll want to assess you. Understand you. And then, in all likelihood, try to shape you toward the purpose he's had in mind since you survived. He met Harry's eyes. Which is why you need to be completely yourself from the moment you walk through that door, and give him absolutely nothing to work with in terms of what he expects. That doesn't sound hard, Harry said. It isn't, Loki agreed. Being yourself is the most difficult thing for other people to account for. They can plan around what they expect. They cannot plan around what you actually are. Harry grinned. Loki did not grin back, but the corner of his mouth did something. The training sessions that summer had a different quality to them, not more intense, exactly, but more complete. Like everything was being consolidated, finalized, shaped into something that could travel. With Thor, they worked on what Thor called the fundamentals, which in practice meant combat without weapons, combat with weapons, combat while using magic, combat while being magicked at, and the related skill of knowing when not to fight, which Thor considered equally important and which Harry, by age 10, had largely mastered, not because he lacked confidence but because he'd learned, slowly and through experience, that the most powerful move in many situations was choosing not to use power. At all. Asgardian warriors, Thor told him once, early in their training relationship, are known for their strength. The best of them are known for knowing what strength is for. Harry had thought about this for days and then come back with, so strength is like a really loud voice. You can use it to win an argument, but that doesn't mean you won the point. Thor had stared at him. Yes. Essentially. Loki said something like that. Of course he did, Thor said, with the tone of someone who was genuinely glad for something and slightly annoyed about it simultaneously. With Loki, the training was different in kind and rhythm. Loki taught the way he did everything, circuitously, with apparent digressions that turned out to be the actual lesson, and with a fundamental respect for Harry's intelligence that manifested as never explaining things twice unless asked. He had spent years carefully mapping the interaction of Harry's two systems of magic, and by now he understood it well enough to teach it, which was remarkable given that no textbook anywhere contained anything about it. The wandless wizardry, the magic Harry had inherited from James and Lily Potter, was in some ways the simpler of the two. It was direct. Responsive to will and emotion and clear intention. Whereas Asgardian seer required mental architecture, required you to construct the shape of what you wanted in your mind before reaching for it, the wizarding magic was more instinctive. You wanted the outcome, you felt the outcome, you produced the outcome. Wands, Loki had concluded, were essentially training wheels for people who couldn't focus the raw power themselves. Harry had never had training wheels. Harry's wizarding magic was entirely unfocused by convention and entirely focused by 10 years of Loki's disciplined instruction, and the result was something that practitioners of either tradition would not have recognized as belonging to them. Cast the warming charm, Loki said one morning, which was something they worked on regularly, the specific charms and spells of the wizarding tradition, because Harry was going to Hogwarts and would need the vocabulary even if his methodology was his own. Harry reached for it. Not the way a Hogwarts student would have, no wand, no verbal incantation, or rather the incantation was there but under his breath, more like a direction than a requirement, and the air around the courtyard warmed by approximately 10 degrees in about 2 seconds. Loki looked up from his notes. That was faster than last week. I found the overlap, Harry said. Between the two systems. The warming charm is just moving energy from one place to another. Seer has about 12 ways to do that, and when I use the wizarding intent on top of the seer structure, the seer provides the architecture and the wizarding magic provides the force, Loki finished. Yes, I see it. Do you feel the efficiency difference? It's almost no effort at all. Harry paused, honestly surprised by this. It should be harder. It should be, Loki agreed. Which means you've integrated something properly rather than just layering it. He made a note. What happens if you try it the other way? Pure wizarding intent, no seer framework. Harry tried. The air warmed again, but with a slightly different quality, less precise, more instinctive, like the difference between a controlled fire and a good campfire. Both warm. Different shape. Still effective, he said. Yes. But do you notice, it goes out further. Less control over the boundary. Harry looked at the edge of the courtyard. When I used the seer frame, it stopped exactly where I wanted it to. That time it warmed about 20 feet past where I intended. Loki was writing quickly. The wizarding magic is more powerful in terms of raw output. The seer is more precise. Used together, both, Harry said. He tried it again, this time consciously blending rather than alternating, feeling for the overlap Loki had described but letting it happen actively rather than by accident. The air warmed. Precise. Strong. Contained exactly to the boundary of the courtyard walls, and warmer than either previous attempt. Loki looked up. That, he said, slowly, was more than either tradition should produce at this level. Good, Harry said simply. Loki looked at him with the expression he wore when something was happening that interested him deeply and he was choosing to respond to it with restraint. Don't get complacent, he said. I'm not complacent, Harry said. I'm accurate. There was a long pause. You, Loki said, returning to his notes, are insufferable. You told me that was a compliment. I was being ironic. You were being proud, Harry said. I can tell the difference. Loki did not look up from his notes. Go run the wall circuit. Twice. Harry went, grinning. Sif found him in the weapons yard that afternoon, which was not unusual. Lady Sif had been a presence in Harry's life since roughly age 4, when she'd walked in on Frigga teaching him the Asgardian fighting stances and declared that if the child was going to learn stances he was going to learn them properly. She had an almost zero-tolerance policy for imprecision and a deeply inconvenient habit of knowing when Harry was cutting corners, which had made her one of his most valuable teachers and also reliably the most irritating person to spar with. Today she was carrying 2 short swords, which she tossed to him without warning as she crossed the yard. He caught them both. His eyes were open but he hadn't technically been looking at her when she threw them, a fact which she noted with a slight nod. The warriors 3 are holding a farewell feast for you, she said. Tonight. Is it a surprise? Volstagg has been talking about it for a week. Then no. No. She drew her own blade. How are you feeling about England? It was a direct question, more direct than Sif usually came. She was a warrior who communicated primarily through combat, not conversation, and the fact that she'd asked told him she actually wanted to know. Ready, he said honestly. Nervous? A little. He raised both swords. Not about the school. About the people. She came at him then, not the training pace she sometimes used with less experienced students, the actual speed that had made her one of Asgard's finest warriors, and he moved to meet her, not quite matching that speed but adapting to it, using his smaller frame as an advantage, using the 2 short swords to redirect rather than block. She was stronger. She was more experienced. He compensated with angles. The people, she said, between exchanges, are going to be shocked by you. I know. He ducked under a sweep, turned, used his left blade to redirect her right. I'm not going to apologize for that. I wouldn't ask you to. She pressed the attack. He gave ground, let her commit to the momentum, used it. But you'll need to be patient with their expectations. Their expectations of the poor tragic orphan who needs rescuing. Yes. Hard to be patient with a fiction. I know. She disengaged for a breath. They circled. But Harry, the people who built that story around you, they're not necessarily enemies. Some of them believe it. Some of them need it. She feinted left, went right. Be smart about the difference. He caught the feint, met the real strike, and for a moment they were locked blade to blade, close enough that he could see clearly that this was a lesson delivered at full combat speed because Sif didn't know how to have important conversations any other way. Some of them, she said quietly, will need you to be the person they expect. And you'll want to dismiss that entirely. Don't. He stepped back, disengaged cleanly. You think I'll be cruel? No. I think you'll be careless. Her voice was direct, not unkind. You are Asgardian in your heart, Harry, which means you are accustomed to speaking plainly and moving directly and not spending much time managing other people's feelings. Midgardian children are, from what I've seen in Thor's travels, considerably more fragile in certain ways. And some of them are going to look at you and want very badly for something that you may not be able to give them. Harry was quiet for a moment, turning this over with the same seriousness he gave everything Sif said in these moments. You think someone's going to need me to be what they expected? I think, she said carefully, that the wizarding world has been telling itself a story about you for 10 years. And some of the people you meet will have grown up inside that story. She put her sword up, one clean motion, patient. That's all I'm asking. You can still be exactly who you are. Just be kind about it. Harry thought about it. He sheathed both swords. Is this what it feels like when you give advice? Yes, Sif said. It feels like talking to your father in a mirror. He laughed, a real one, sudden and bright, and she allowed herself a slight smile, which on Sif was equivalent to a broad grin on anyone else. The warriors three threw him a feast that was exactly as enormous as Volstag's involvement guaranteed. The table in the great hall was expanded to accommodate what seemed like half the palace, the warriors three in their various glorious states of revelry, Sif seated at Harry's right because proximity to Sif was a deterrent to the kind of over-enthusiastic affection that Volstagg in particular was prone to after the third horn of mead, a dozen palace warriors who had crossed paths with Harry in training over the years. Frigga at one end of the table with the serene authority of someone who had decided tonight was for watching, and Odin at the other end with Gungnir leaned against his chair and the expression he wore at gatherings he hadn't organized but wouldn't insult by leaving. Loki was there, naturally, seated slightly apart from the general enthusiasm the way he always was, but drinking something and talking, actually talking, in that quiet, pointed way, to one of the younger scholars who'd worked on Harry's magical documentation. Thor was at Harry's left, which was where Thor had been at every table in Harry's memory, a fact Harry had never remarked on because it hadn't needed remarking. Fandral, who had a genuine gift for toasts and knew it, stood at some point between the third and fourth courses and raised his horn. To Harlan Odinson, he said, with the theatrical flair that Harry had spent years finding both deeply embarrassing and secretly beloved, who has beaten every warrior at this table at least once, who has set fire to things in at least 6 of the 9 realms, that was Loki, Harry said. Who has the most alarming eyes I have ever seen on anyone under the age of 200, they're just green, Fandral. Who is, above all, the finest young warrior and the most chaotic breakfast companion this palace has ever produced. He lifted the horn. May England survive the encounter. Everyone drank. Volstagg laughed loudly enough to rattle the table settings. Harry grinned and felt, under the grin, something warm and complete and slightly painful in the way that good things can be when you're aware they're about to shift. He looked around the table, at Sif's controlled smile and Fandrel's theatrics and Hogun's quiet steady presence and Volstag's enormous joy and his grandmother at one end and his grandfather at the other and Loki pretending not to watch from his position of tactical remove, and then he looked at his father, who was already looking at him, and who looked away first in the particular way that meant he was feeling something he had decided not to say yet. Harry filed this away. Later, the feast winding down, Volstagg already asleep on a bench, the other warriors dispersing into the Asgardian night, Harry found Thor on the balcony. Their balcony, as it had become over the years. The one that looked out over the golden rooftops toward the Bifrost. "You were quiet tonight," Harry said, which was the same observation Thor had made to him years ago, returned now with comfortable familiarity. "I was thinking," Thor said, which was the same answer. "About September. About you." Thor leaned on the balcony railing, looking out. The city below was warm with light, the Bifrost a distant column of color at the horizon. "I know you're ready. I know that." He paused. "I know you're going to walk into that school and it's going to be, fine," Harry said. "I was going to say, complicated. It'll be both." Harry leaned on the railing beside him. "Habai. I'm not going to a battlefield." "You might be," Thor said, quietly. "Not with swords. But there are things at that school that are moving toward, there are people there with agendas, with interests in you specifically, and he stopped. Started again. "I have sent you into danger before. In the realms. But you were with me. I know. You won't be with me there. Not in the same way." "I'll have Loki's mirror," Harry said. "And Heimdall. And you could be there in about 30 seconds if I needed you." 20, Thor said, with the automatic precision of someone who had actually calculated this. Harry smiled. 20 seconds. "And yet," Thor said, "there is a difference between knowing that and," he turned, looking at his son full on, and in his face was something that Harry had seen only a few times, something that lived under the warrior and the prince and the thunder god. "You are my son," Thor said. "Not in the way of blood. In the only way that matters. And I am not telling you not to go. I'm not asking you to be careful in the way that means diminished. You're allowed to worry," Harry said. "That's not weakness." Thor stared at him. "Loki said that," Harry said. "But I think he got it from you originally." A long pause. "He would never admit that," Thor said. "Absolutely not." Harry straightened. "I'm going to go to Hogwarts and I'm going to be exactly what I am, and the wizarding world is going to have to adjust. And whatever Voldemort is planning, or whatever Dumbledore is planning, or whatever anyone has planned around the idea of what I'm supposed to be, none of it accounts for what I actually am. And that's not arrogance." He looked at Thor. "That's just accurate." Thor looked at him for a long moment. Then he put one enormous hand on top of Harry's head, which was something he'd done since Harry was very small and which Harry received with the same dignified tolerance he always had. "Accurate," Thor said. "Yes." They stood there for another while, looking at the Golden City, not needing to say anything more. 3 weeks before September, Loki called Harry to his study. This was the room where most of Harry's actual education had happened, floor to ceiling with books, several surfaces permanently occupied by ongoing experiments, the large silver mirror in the corner that Loki used for observation of the other realms, which had a quality of depth to it that made you feel like you were looking through it rather than at it. Harry sat in his usual chair, the worn one across from Loki's desk, which had been worn specifically by Harry over the years, and waited. Loki had 3 books open on the desk and was standing behind them, which was unusual. He typically sat. "I want to show you something," Loki said, and gestured at the mirror. It shimmered. An image resolved, a street. Narrow, cobblestoned, lined with shops. An alley somewhere that caught London light between old brick buildings. People in robes moving briskly past. Diagon Alley, Harry said. He'd seen it in the mirror before but only briefly. Watch, Loki said. Harry watched. The image moved, as if Loki's perspective was drifting through the alley. Past a wand shop, Harry felt something when they passed it, a faint pull at the edge of his senses that he recognized as the wizarding magic in him responding to concentrated sources of similar energy. Past a bookshop. Past an apothecary. And then the image resolved on a building that was different from the others, lower, squat and white, official in a way that spoke of authority deliberately displayed. A bank. Gringotts, Loki said. Run by goblins. Financial institution for the wizarding world. It contains, and here his voice shifted just slightly, the way it did when he was arriving at the actual point, vaults belonging to various families. One of those vaults belongs to the Potter family. He paused. Which is to say, it belongs to you. Harry looked at the image. You're saying I have money. I'm saying you have considerable assets in a currency that will be useful where you're going, managed by an institution that has held the account since before your birth, and that you have a right to access. Loki met his eyes. I'm also saying that the existence of that vault means your identity in the wizarding world is legally documented. They know you exist. They know who you are, or rather, who you were born. Going to Hogwarts as Harlan Odinson is going to raise questions. Harry had thought about this. I'm not going as someone else. No, Loki agreed. You'll go as Harry. As yourself. But you'll need to be prepared for the fact that Harry Potter, the name, carries weight in that world that has nothing to do with you. It's my name too, Harry said. One of them. Loki closed one of the books. There's something else. He came around the desk, which he did when he was being genuinely serious rather than pedagogically theatrical, and sat in the chair beside Harry's rather than across from him. I've been doing extensive research on the Horcrux. Harry looked at him sharply. Voldemort's method of surviving death, Loki continued, was to fragment his own soul and bind pieces of it to objects. This is ancient dark magic. The Asgardian equivalent doesn't quite exist, but the concept appears in the darker corners of several traditions, and it means that so long as those objects exist, he cannot truly die. He paused. One of those soul fragments is in you. The study was very quiet. In the scar, Harry said. In the scar. When the killing curse rebounded, the piece of Voldemort's soul that was riding the curse, for that kind of magic requires proximity of a fragment to function properly, was torn free and anchored to the nearest living magical thing. Which was you. A pause. You have been carrying a fragment of another person's soul in your body for your entire life. Harry sat with this. He was 10. He had been told things that would have broken most people across the course of his 10 years, and he had a particular way of receiving difficult information, not suppressing it, not performing calm, but actually going still and sitting with the weight of something until he understood its shape. He did that now. Can it be removed? He asked. That, Loki said, is what I have been working on for approximately 2 years. He stood, went to the desk, opened a specific book, old, the binding worn, pages so thin they were nearly translucent. In theory, yes. The fragment can be destroyed if the anchor, the scar, in this case, is treated correctly. Not with dark magic, which would destroy everything in proximity, but with something older. He looked at Harry. The same magic that deflected the curse in the first place. My mother's sacrifice. Love as a counterspell, Loki said, and his voice was very level, which with Loki meant he was feeling something he was being careful with. It is, as your grandfather said the night you arrived, one of the oldest magics. And it left a residue in you that has been doing something interesting for 10 years. He turned the book around so Harry could see the page. It's been slowly, very slowly, working at the fragment. Containing it. And every time you engage in genuine emotion, genuine connection, genuine care, he stopped. It weakens the fragment, Harry said. More than that. I believe it is converting it. The soul fragment cannot survive sustained proximity to its opposite, cannot survive in a host who is genuinely, fundamentally loved and who loves in return. He closed the book. I am telling you this not because you need to do anything about it today, but because you need to understand that the protection your mother gave you is not a passive shield. It is an active force. And it has been living in you alongside the darkness, and it is winning. Harry looked at his hands. He thought about Frigga teaching him to read by firelight. About Thor's hand on his shoulder on the balcony. About Loki specifically, sitting across from him in this study for 6 years, treating his mind as something worth genuine investment. You've known about this for 2 years, Harry said. Yes. And you've been sitting on it. I've been researching it, Loki said, with exactly the precision of someone who is correct and knows it. There is a difference between knowing something exists and knowing what to do with the knowing. I didn't tell you until I had something useful to tell you. A pause. And until I was certain it was good news rather than just news. Harry looked at him. Is it good news? Loki considered. I believe, he said carefully, that in time, with sustained connection, with the love that has surrounded you in this place, the fragment will be rendered inert. Possibly destroyed entirely, though that will depend on variables I cannot yet control. He met Harry's eyes. I believe that what your mother did for you, and what this family has done for you since, has been the most effective countermagic possible. Unintentionally. Which is how the best magic usually works. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then, you're saying that Asgard cured me by just being Asgard. I'm saying that love, in this case, is not a metaphor. A pause. As irritating as I find that conclusion. Harry looked at his uncle, at the careful, precise face that hid everything and showed everything to the people who knew how to read it, and felt something settle in his chest. Thank you, he said. For telling me. Loki nodded once, sharply, and went back around the desk. Don't make it sentimental, he said. I have research to do. Harry stood. He was almost at the door when Loki said, without looking up, you're going to do well there. In case that needed saying. Harry smiled. Loki. What? You're doing that thing where you're proud but you've decided not to be obvious about it. I have no idea what you're talking about. Sure. Harry opened the door. I'll see you at dinner. He left. Behind him, in the study, Loki sat very still for a moment, not reading the open book, looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone experiencing an emotion they have categorized as inconvenient and are choosing to sit with anyway. The day before September 1st, the whole family went to Diagon Alley. This required a certain amount of negotiation: Frigga's idea, Odin's reluctant agreement, Thor's enthusiasm, Loki's conditions, which were primarily that he not be required to explain himself to anyone and that he be allowed to spend time in the bookshop. Harry's conditions were simpler, which was that everyone be approximately normal, which even as he said it he understood was a structural impossibility. They came through the Bifrost to a quiet patch of London parkland and walked from there, 5 of them in what were either very fine ordinary clothes or very finely disguised Asgardian ones, depending on how you looked. Frigga had ensured the disguise, meaning the golden light that usually clung to the Asgardian royal family was muted, their height and presence dialed back from immediately alarming to merely striking. Loki had his own disguise that he hadn't discussed with anyone and which was just him in a dark coat that suited him well and an expression that dared anyone to question it. The leaky cauldron was noisy and dim and smelled of old wood and something burnt, which Harry found immediately comfortable in a way he hadn't expected. The barman, a man with a face like a crumpled map who introduced himself as Tom and who seemed to be having a very normal Tuesday, did a double take at Harry's scar that he quickly corrected into professional hospitality. Then he did a second double take at Thor. Passing through, Thor said cheerfully. Of course, sir, said Tom. Right through the back. The brick wall opened. Diagon Alley spread before them. Harry had seen it in Loki's mirror, but the mirror hadn't conveyed the sound of it, or the smell of it, potion ingredients and old parchment and something alchemical and burnt, or the way the magic hung in the air visibly, almost, like humidity on a warm day. He stood for a moment, adjusting to it, and felt the two systems of magic in him respond. The wandless wizardry lit up. That was the only way to describe it. It woke up, the way a person wakes up when they come home after a long time away. Not because he'd been here before, but because this was the tradition he'd been born into, and being surrounded by it was like hearing a language he'd always known spoken aloud for the first time. Loki was watching him. "Well," he said quietly. "It's," Harry paused. "Loud. Magically. Not in a bad way. Like a crowded market, but everything is talking." Loki's eyes moved through the alley with interest. "What are they saying?" "Nothing specific. Just, present. Alive." He looked at his uncle. "The seer doesn't do this. Even in Asgard, around other seer users, it doesn't feel like this. The tradition is closer to your original inheritance," Loki said. "Your body recognizes it. Does that matter?" "It means you're genuinely of both worlds," Loki said. "Not a hybrid. Actually of both. Which is," he paused, clearly arriving at a conclusion he found interesting. "That has implications I'll need to think about." Thor had his hand on Harry's shoulder, the way he did in new places, not guiding but present. "Vault first," he said. "Then supplies." Then, he looked at Loki. "The bookshop." "I know. 45 minutes minimum," Loki said, already looking at it from 30 yards away. "An hour," Frigga said, which settled it. Gringotts was cool and white-pillared and full of goblins who were doing the careful work of pretending not to look at their group and looking anyway. Harry walked in with his father and his grandmother and his uncle and the head goblin at the desk, who had the magnificent name Griphook Sr. and the expression of someone who had been managing the financial affairs of difficult people for a very long time, looked at Harry for one moment and then looked at the family he'd come with, and then looked back, and said in a very measured tone, "Mr. Potter. We had wondered when to expect you." "Harry," said. "Odinson works too." A pause. Griphook Sr. looked at Thor. Thor looked back with the particular brand of cheerful implacability that he'd had since approximately the 1st century of his life. The goblin looked back at Harry. "Your vault," he said, "has been undisturbed. And has been accruing interest." He paused. "Considerable interest." "How considerable?" Loki asked, because of course he did. "Goblin banking," Griphook Sr. said carefully, "does not discuss the specifics of client accounts with family," Harry said pleasantly. "Their family." Another pause. Griphook Sr. made a decision with the air of someone choosing their battles. "Considerable," he repeated. The vault was deeper than Harry had expected, the cart ride was wonderful and horrible in equal measure, the tunnels plunging through Gringotts' underground depths, the carts moving at a speed that suggested the goblins had either excellent engineering or absolutely no regard for the comfort of passengers. Harry liked it enormously. Thor held on to the cart with the expression of someone who was not going to admit that the speed was notable. Frigga looked perfectly composed. Loki looked deeply interested in the structural engineering of the tunnels. Vault 687, Potter Family Vault, contained a lot. Stacks of gold galleons, silver sickles, bronze nuts in quantities that Harry, who had been raised in a palace and therefore had a reasonable reference point for wealth, found genuinely substantial. There were also some objects, a few sealed letters, some small items wrapped carefully, a wedding photograph in a silver frame. He took the photograph. His parents on their wedding day, young, bright, his mother laughing at something off camera, his father mid-laugh in response. They looked like people he would have liked. He put it in his pocket and didn't say anything about it, and nobody asked. The wand shop was called Ollivander's, and it was the last stop before the bookshop, and it was the most interesting 40 minutes Harry had spent in Diagon Alley. Ollivander himself was an elderly man with pale, lamp-like eyes who moved through his shop with the quiet authority of someone in their specific domain, and who took one look at Harry and said, Harlan Odinson, in a tone of someone completing a sentence they'd started 10 years ago. Then his eyes moved to the scar and he went very still. Harry said. Mr. Allfather. I remember every wand I've ever sold, Allfather said, still looking at the scar. I remember the wands your parents purchased. I remember, he stopped. Started again. And I remember the wand that made that mark. 10¼ inches, you, Phoenix Feather Core. The brother wand, he added, looking at Harry carefully, to yours. Mine, Harry said. He held out his hand. Should we find out? What followed was an experiment that Allfather found clearly both fascinating and disorienting. Wand after wand, Harry tried them all with the polite curiosity of a scientist and the complete lack of particular enthusiasm of someone who knew they had working alternatives, and none of them quite fit, which was what Harry had expected. His magic was not the kind that fit conventional wands. Too dual-natured. Too integrated. The wand that was technically his brother, 10¼ U, he'd said, Allfather didn't have in stock. Then Allfather went very far into the back shelves and came back with something that looked different from the others. Older. The wood was a deep, nearly black mahogany, the grain fine, and the length was 11½ inches, longer than average, with a core that Allfather described in a slightly unsteady voice as thunderbird tail feather. Rather rare. And the wood is, I obtained it years ago from a traveling merchant who said it came from a tree that had been struck by lightning so many times it had stopped falling and started absorbing. I have never found its match. Harry took it. The feeling was not the expected warmth and rush of sparks that various sources described. It was more like recognition. The dual systems of his magic, which usually maintained a kind of spiraling relationship, suddenly aligned, briefly and completely, and the air in the shop crackled and the old books rattled on their shelves, and outside, beyond the dusty shop window, the sky over Diagon Alley produced a single short rumble of thunder from a perfectly clear sky. Allfather was staring at him. Behind Harry, he heard Loki make a small sound that might have been satisfaction. And behind Loki, Thor said nothing at all, but the hand that came to rest on Harry's shoulder for a brief moment said everything it needed to. How much? Harry asked. 7 galleons, Allfather said faintly. As always. Harry paid. He pocketed the wand, which felt immediately like something that had been in his pocket his whole life, and turned to his family. Bookshop, Loki said immediately. Bookshop, Harry agreed. They went. The morning of September 1st, the whole palace was very slightly louder and very slightly busier than usual, for no official reason. Warriors found reasons to be in the corridors near the family's quarters. Scholars appeared in the breakfast hall who did not usually eat there. Frigga had arranged a breakfast that was far larger than the 5 of them required. Odin sat at the head of the table with the air of someone engaged in normal morning routines and clearly not watching Harry eat his breakfast, which he was absolutely watching. Harry ate everything on his plate because the food was excellent and he was not particularly prone to nerves manifesting as loss of appetite, and then he went around the table and kissed Frigga on the cheek and got her arms around him briefly and her voice in his ear saying something very quiet and specific that was just for him. He put his hand on Odin's arm as he passed, and Odin put his hand over Harry's without looking up from whatever he was reading, and held it there for 2 seconds, and let go. He squared up his trunk, books, cauldron, new robes, the photograph, Mjolnir's older practice hammer which Thor had given him as a joke and which he'd kept because it actually fit in his trunk and because it had been a gift, and slung his bag over his shoulder. Loki was waiting in the corridor. He looked Harry over once, the way he looked over his work after he'd been satisfied it was correct. The mirror will show you at the station, Loki said. I'll be watching. If there's anything you need, I'll know, Harry said. The mirror works both ways if I concentrate on it. Correct. A pause. Don't let anyone bore you into conformity. Harry grinned. Never have. No, Loki agreed. You haven't. He stepped aside. Then, at the last moment, Harry. Yeah. The Sorting Hat, Loki said. I have a theory about what it will do with you that I want to test. Don't give it an easy answer. Harry tilted his head. What's your theory? Find out for yourself. You're more interesting that way. Harry shook his head and walked down the corridor toward Thor, who was waiting at the far end with the look of a man who had decided that being very normal about this was not going to be achievable but was going to make the attempt. They took the Bifrost to London. Harry felt the usual pull and surge and release of the bridge, and when he stepped out onto the solid grey morning of King's Cross Station, he felt both worlds in him simultaneously, the Asgardian seer humming at a lower register in the cool English air, the wizarding magic rising toward him from the direction of platform 9 3/4 with that same electric recognition he'd felt in Diagon Alley. Thor stood beside him. Large. Conspicuous. Entirely unconcerned about either. Harry looked at the station, at the people moving through it, at the distant column of steam visible from the right direction, and breathed in the London morning, cold stone and diesel and the distant smell of magic. Ready, he said. Thor looked at him. Green eyes. Lightning scar. The wand in his pocket and the seer in his blood and 10 years of Asgard in the shape of his spine. I know, Thor said. They walked through the barrier together, and the world of wizards opened to receive, with no idea whatsoever, the Thunder Prince it had been preparing for all this time. Chapter 3, The Boy Who Lived, Differently. The Hogwarts Express was red and enormous and billowing steam in a way that Harry found genuinely charming, and the platform was chaos in the best possible sense, children everywhere in robes, owls in cages, cats underfoot, parents calling last-minute instructions that their children were already not listening to, and the particular energy of a crowd that was both excited and nervous in equal measure. Harry stood on platform 9 3/4 with his trunk floating beside him. He'd done it without thinking, which was the point Loki had been making for years about integrated magic, and looked at it all with the calm interest of someone arriving somewhere new and finding it exactly as interesting as advertised. Thor was beside him, which meant several of the nearby parents were performing the impressive social acrobatics of very obviously noticing Thor and choosing not to say anything, which was its own form of entertainment. There's an owl car, Harry said, looking down the train. Hedwig would hate the owl car. He'd acquired the snowy owl in Diagon Alley, somewhat accidentally, in that he'd gone in to buy a standard school owl and Hedwig had climbed onto his arm and looked at him with the absolute authority of an animal that has made a decision, and he'd bought her instead. She was currently in a cage on top of his floating trunk, conducting a methodical survey of the platform. She would, Thor agreed. He was doing that thing where he was being very deliberately normal about the fact that in approximately 4 minutes Harry was going to get on a train and go somewhere Thor couldn't follow on foot. Your robes are straight. My robes are always straight. They have a tendency to, Pabai. Yes. All right, Harry said. Hedwig's very fast. Probably faster than most platform owls, honestly. And Heimdall will watch, and Loki will watch, and if anything, I know, Thor said. I know all of that. He put one hand briefly on Harry's shoulder, the usual gesture, the one that meant more than any of the words around it. I am not worried about your safety. He looked at his son directly. I am going to miss you at breakfast. That's all. Harry didn't say anything for a moment. Then he grabbed his father around the middle in the particular way he'd been doing since he was small enough to only reach Thor's waist, which no longer applied because Harry was 10 and tall for it, and Thor's arms came around him immediately and completely, the way they had been doing since Godric's Hollow. 2 seconds. 3. Then Harry stepped back, squared his shoulders, took the handle of his trunk out of the air where it had been floating, and turned toward the train. He was almost there when the voice happened. Excuse me, you're Harry Potter, aren't you? He turned. A girl about his age, brown bushy hair, an expression of focused intensity that reminded him somewhat of Loki in the middle of research, bright, slightly impatient, genuinely curious underneath. She was holding a very large book. She had the look of someone who had been wanting to ask this question for 30 seconds and had been debating the social calculus of it. Harry, he said. Harry Odinson. Potter was my birth name. She blinked. Recalibrated. I'm Hermione Granger. I've read about you, well, I've read about Harry Potter, quite a lot actually, though some of it seems rather unreliable as source material. The wizarding histories tend toward the hagiographic when it comes to, sorry, I'm rambling. She stopped herself with visible effort. Are you really the boy who lived? He considered this. I'm the boy who lived in Asgard for 10 years and is going to Hogwarts to see what British wizards are like. She stared at him. Asgard, she said. As in the Norse, as in the, she seemed to be rearranging several things at once. Is that why none of the owls could find you? They sent 11 of them, you know. I read about it in a letter my parents received from the school. They couldn't understand where you'd gone. I went to Asgard. That's, she paused. Then, with the air of someone choosing the intellectually honest response over the socially easy one, that's extraordinary. I have questions. I have answers, Harry said. Are you on the train? Yes, obviously. Then ask on the train. He gestured at the door. She went, which she did efficiently because she was clearly the kind of person who was efficient about things, and Harry followed, glancing back once at Thor, who was standing on the platform looking at the train with his arms crossed and his expression doing the thing it did when he was being stoic about something. Harry raised one hand. Thor raised one back. Harry got on the train. The compartment Hermione led him to had 2 other people in it already. A red-haired boy with an air of slightly dazed bewilderment who introduced himself as Ron Weasley and whose name Harry recognized from Loki's research, large wizarding family, old bloodline, good people by most accounts, and a toad that apparently belonged to a nervous-looking boy named Neville who'd put his head in briefly to ask if anyone had seen it, received a collective negative, and retreated. Harry stored his trunk, without magic this time, which Hermione noticed and said nothing about, but her eyes did something, and sat across from Ron, and Hedwig shifted proprietarily on her cage, and the train began to move. You're Harry Potter, Ron said, with the awe of someone who had grown up with this name as a story rather than a person. Harry Odinson, technically. But yes, I'm him. Ron's ears went slightly red, which Harry was already learning was a Weasley indicator of social processing. My mum, everyone, I mean, you're sort of, people have been talking about you coming to Hogwarts all summer. My mum kept telling my brothers to, anyway. He regrouped. You really live in Asgard? Like, actual Asgard? I really do. With Thor. He's my father. Ron stared at him. Thor, he said. Thor Odinson. The Thor. There's only the one. Your dad is Thor. Yes. Ron sat back against the seat and appeared to be performing some kind of internal recalibration that was significant enough to require a moment of silence. Harry waited, which he was patient about. It was Sif's advice in practice, letting people have their moment of adjustment. What's he like? Ron asked eventually. In real life, I mean. The books say I grew up reading about, he's large, Harry said. He laughs at his own jokes. He threw a feast table once because someone spilled his mead, but that was years ago, and he's gotten much better about it. Ron laughed, sudden and genuine. Hermione, who had opened her book again with the air of someone who had decided to observe this interaction while reading, didn't look up but the corner of her mouth moved. And Loki, she said, to the page. Harry looked at her. What about Loki? Is he, the histories, the myths describe him as, my uncle, Harry said pleasantly. He taught me magic for 6 years. He's extremely clever, frequently the most interesting person in any room, and he told me the British wizards had a game where you fly around on brooms and I need to see if he described it accurately. Quidditch, Ron said, with the energy of someone offered a subject they could speak about at length. It's on brooms, you've never seen it. It's the best, I fly without a broom, Harry said. So I'm curious what the brooms add. Ron opened his mouth. Closed it. You fly. On your own. Asgardian princes tend to develop the ability. My father does it. I have a different method. He paused. Seer, mostly, with some of the wizarding tradition underneath it. I don't do it constantly because it draws attention. Everything about you draws attention, Hermione said, and now she had put the book down, because Harry had apparently become more interesting than the book, which he suspected was not a small achievement. I've been reading about Asgardian seer this summer. I found 3 sources. They're not widely available in wizarding libraries, and the intersection of it with conventional wand work is theoretically, there's almost no academic literature on it. Loki's written some, Harry said. I could ask him to share. She stared at him with the expression of someone physically restraining themselves from saying yes immediately. That would be, that's a significant academic resource. I'll ask. They looked at each other, the Prince of Asgard and the girl with the large book, and something settled between them that wasn't quite friendship yet but was its direct predecessor. The compartment door slid open at a point somewhere between London and Scotland, and admitted 3 people who were not invited and who entered with the clear expectation that this would not be a problem. The one in front was pale, pointed, blonde, with the assurance of someone who had been told his whole life that rooms rearranged themselves for him. He was wearing robes that were very new and very good, and he was looking at Harry with an expression Harry recognized immediately, the face of someone who had rehearsed this moment. Harry Potter, said Draco Malfoy. I heard you were on the train. Hi, Harry said. Draco blinked. He had clearly prepared for several openings. This particular brevity was not among them. He recovered quickly. He was smart, Harry noted, or at least socially quick, which wasn't the same thing but was often mistaken for it. I'm Draco Malfoy. Harry Odinson. Another blink. Right. Yes. I heard, Asgard, was it? He said it with studied lightness, the kind that meant he'd been thinking about how to say it. He glanced at the 2 flanking him, large, dull-faced boys who communicated backup rather than intelligence. Unusual. Most things worth doing are, Harry said. Draco looked at Ron then, and the shift in his expression was slight but readable, a downgrade in estimation so practiced it was nearly unconscious. Old money looking at less money and finding the distinction load-bearing. Weasley, he said. Not a greeting. A categorization. Ron's jaw tightened. Harry watched this and thought about what Sif had said, about patience, and also thought about the fact that patience with people who were being directly rude to someone in his compartment was a specifically bounded virtue. He asked you a question, Harry said pleasantly. Draco turned back to him. Sorry. You said Weasley. That wasn't a question or a greeting. It was a way of making someone feel small. Harry's tone was conversational, not aggressive. He'd learned from Loki that the most effective responses were the ones that didn't give the other person a fight to grab onto. I'm asking you to try again. The compartment was quiet. Draco's 2 companions looked at each other. Draco himself went through several expressions in quick succession, surprise, irritation, recalculation, and landed on something that was neither capitulation nor escalation, which Harry thought was actually to his credit. Weasley, Draco said again, with a fractionally different intonation, not warm, but addressed, which was at least honest. He looked back at Harry. I came to say that in Hogwarts, the company you keep matters. Some families are good people and some aren't, Harry said, and I've found that whether someone has gold or not tells me almost nothing useful about which kind they are. I grew up with warriors who'd give their last meal to a stranger. And I grew up reading about people with very old names doing very small-minded things. A silence. You're not what I expected, Draco said. I know, Harry said. Most people aren't what they expect either. He looked at Draco steadily. You're clearly not stupid. That's useful if you use it well. Draco stared at him. He was, Harry suspected, not used to being evaluated rather than impressed or dismissed. It didn't entirely displease him, the expression was complex enough that there was something in it that wanted to respond. He looked at Harry for another moment, then at Ron, then at Hermione, who was watching the whole exchange with the analytical interest of someone taking notes. "Right," Draco said, finally. He withdrew without another word, pulling the door shut. The two large boys went with him, looking confused. The compartment was quiet for 2 seconds. "That was," Ron started. "He's not entirely lost," Harry said. "He's been told his whole life that the story he grew up in is the only true one. That's not evil. It's just, incomplete." "He was being rude to me," Ron said. "Yes," Harry said. "Which I also noticed. Hence the correction." He looked at Ron evenly. "He won't do it again." Ron looked at him for a moment. Then, "You're weird," he said, with the warmth that Harry was already learning was how Ron Weasley expressed genuine approval. "My uncle says that too," Harry said. "Meant as a compliment." "Is it?" "Always," Harry said. Hermione had opened her book again, but she was smiling at the page. Hogwarts appeared out of the Scottish evening like something from an old story, which it was, Harry supposed, though he'd grown up in Asgard and his threshold for impressive architecture was genuinely high. Still, there was something about the castle that struck him differently from expected, not because it was grand but because it was alive with magic. The way Diagon Alley had been alive, but more concentrated, older, deeper, centuries of accumulated magical practice layered into the stones like rings in a tree. His wizarding inheritance responded to it the same way it had in the alley, but stronger here. More like a conversation and less like a hello. The boats crossed the dark lake in the cold and Harry sat in one with Ron and Hermione and looked up at the castle and thought about Loki's mirror and about what Loki had said, "You are genuinely of both worlds. Not a hybrid. Actually of both." Standing on the threshold of one of those worlds felt like confirmation of something. He also thought about Dumbledore, and about doorsteps in November, and arranged his face to give away nothing about either. Professor McGonagall was exactly what Loki's research had described, precise, principled, formidable, with a moral seriousness that Harry found immediately respectable. She collected the first years at the entrance with efficient authority and delivered the standard address about houses and the sorting with the manner of someone who had done this many times and saw no reason to be theatrical about it. Harry listened. Around him, other first-years whispered and jostled nervously. He stood still, hands in his pockets, taking in the great hall beyond the closed door. He could feel the magic in there, the enchanted ceiling Hermione had told him about on the train, the 4 long tables, the high table at the end. He felt, from that direction, a particular kind of awareness. Someone at the high table was watching him specifically, had been since he'd arrived in the entrance hall. He couldn't see who yet, but the attention was directed and deliberate, and it felt like the attention of someone doing an assessment. Dumbledore, then. Interesting that it started immediately. Harry said nothing and kept his expression pleasant. The hall was everything it should have been, the ceiling a perfect simulation of the clouded Scottish night sky, the candles floating, for long tables of students turning to look as the first years filed in. Harry walked in with the others, noting the points of attention, Dumbledore at the center of the high table, older than the illustrations but with an alertness that was immediately apparent. Snape to one side, dark-robed, with an expression of controlled assessment that shifted, briefly and completely, when he saw Harry's face, and specifically, Harry suspected, the eyes, which were Lily Potter's eyes, and which Snape recognized immediately in a way that moved through his face like weather. Harry noted this without reaction. He'd been warned about Snape too. A ghost floated through the wall wearing a ruff and bleeding from a head wound. Harry watched it pass. Ron made a muffled sound. Hermione watched with the intensity of someone checking information against expectation. "Nearly headless Nick," she murmured. "Gryffindor ghost," Harry said. "How do you know that?" "My uncle is very thorough." The Sorting Hat sat on a stool, an ancient, patched, pointed thing. It opened its brim and sang, a long verse about the 4 houses, their qualities, their founders, and Harry listened with interest because Loki had told him to pay attention to the hat specifically. "Don't give it an easy answer," Loki had said. "I want to test a theory." The list of names began. Hannah Abbott. Susan Bones. Harry watched the hat work, watched it drop over different heads, pause for varying lengths of time, and call houses with the decisive bark of something that had done this a very long time. He watched students' faces as they crossed to their tables, the relief of belonging, the occasional flicker of surprise. Harry Odinson. The silence that followed his name was different from the silences following the others. It spread outward from the name itself like a ripple from a stone, because the name was wrong. Everyone here expected Potter, and also right, because who else, and the whispers started immediately, confirming what the scar had already announced. He walked to the stool with his usual unhurried directness and sat down, and the hat dropped over his head, and it was dark inside the brim. Then the hat spoke, and it spoke only inside his head, and what it said was not the usual opening gambit. "Oh," it said, and it sounded genuinely startled. "Oh, that's new." "Hello," Harry thought back. "I've sorted thousands of students," the hat said, with the air of something recalibrating. "I've never sorted one who thought back at me quite so, deliberately." "I was told you were interesting," Harry said. "Who told you that?" "Someone who knows how things work." The hat seemed to consider this. Harry felt it working, not the usual quick assessment but something more careful, the way you'd handle something unexpectedly complex. It moved through him layer by layer, and he let it, because there was no point in resistance and because genuine curiosity about what it would find was his primary mode of operating. "You are," the hat said slowly, "the most unusual student I have encountered since the founders, possibly. Perhaps longer. You carry two systems of power, and they're not fighting each other, they're talking," Harry supplied. "Yes. Exactly." A pause. "You should have been impossible to raise the way you were raised. The magical traditions don't integrate like this, they exist separately, practitioners of one rarely have meaningful access to the other. And yet here you are, and what you are is," another pause. "I am going to have some difficulty with you." "I was told," Harry said, "not to give you an easy answer." "Whoever told you that," the hat said, with something like dry appreciation, "was not wrong." It moved again, deeper, genuinely searching, and then it stopped moving. Because what it found, underneath the seer and the wizarding magic and the battle-trained mind and the 10 years of Asgardian warmth and belonging, underneath all of that, was something the hat had seen before, but never quite so clearly. A particular quality of intelligence that was both genuine and practical, that sought knowledge not for status but for use. A bravery that was not the absence of caution but the considered decision to move forward anyway. A loyalty that was bone-deep and chosen rather than inherited. And something else. Something the hat had no good word for except perhaps largeness. Not arrogance, he'd sorted plenty of arrogant students and this was not that. This was the sense of a person who had genuinely expanded into the space available to them and found it sufficient and was curious about what came next. "You could go anywhere," the hat said. "Any house would have you. Slytherin wants you, you have the kind of intelligence that values effectiveness, and you understand power structures in ways most 11-year-olds don't. Ravenclaw would take you in a moment, the mind in here is, yes. Hufflepuff would appreciate the loyalty, and it's real, not performed. And Gryffindor, what about Gryffindor?" Harry thought. Gryffindor, the hat said, was founded on the principle that the bravest act is choosing your own path when every other path has been chosen for you. A pause. "Which is," it added, with something that in a person would have been called wry, "rather exactly what you've done." "Then you know," Harry said. "Yes," the hat said. "I know." And then, aloud, to the great hall, in its carrying voice, "Gryffindor." The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry lifted the hat off his head, handed it back to McGonagall, who was looking at him with an expression that was performing neutrality and not entirely succeeding, and walked to the Gryffindor table, where where a space opened for him between students who were clapping and staring and trying to do both simultaneously. At the high table, Dumbledore was watching with the particular attention of someone watching something they had planned for and something else happening at the same time, and trying to understand the second thing. His eyes were sharp and blue and old, and they moved from Harry's face to his scar to the confident ease of his walk, and back. Harry met his eyes briefly, without challenge, without deference. A neutral look that said simply "I see you" looking and nothing more. Dumbledore's expression shifted just slightly. A recalibration. Harry sat down beside a red-haired boy he didn't know yet, a prefect who introduced himself as Percy Weasley, Ron's older brother, with the kind of formal enthusiasm that suggested he'd been practicing this moment, and across from the Weasley twins, Fred and George, who looked at Harry with the twin expressions of people who had just identified someone interesting. "You made the hat think," one of them said. "George," the other said, which meant the first one was Fred. "Probably. 4 minutes," Fred said. Dumbledore himself was 11 seconds. "I had an unusual situation," Harry said. "What kind of unusual?" "The hat found me difficult to categorize." The twins looked at each other with the efficiency of people who share a primary communication channel. Then they looked back at Harry with expressions that were unmistakably delighted. "We're going to be friends," George said. "I think that's likely," Harry agreed. Professor Dumbledore rose at the end of the sorting for his customary welcome, and Harry watched him, really watched him, with the kind of attention Loki had trained in him over years, the attention that goes past the surface of what someone presents. Dumbledore was warm. That was the first thing. Genuinely warm. The twinkle in his eyes wasn't performance, or wasn't entirely performance. He loved this school. He loved the students in it, in the abstract and genuine way that a gardener loves a garden. But underneath the warmth was architecture. Very old architecture, built from very old decisions, and some of those decisions had weight that they were never meant to carry onto the people around them. The speech was brief, characteristic, and ended with a few apparently genial rules about the Forbidden Forest and a banned items list that the Weasley twins immediately began annotating in whispers. And then Dumbledore's eyes found Harry again, just for a moment, just a second of that direct, measuring gaze, and Harry received it the same way he'd received the first one. Quietly. Completely present. Giving nothing away, but not because he was afraid. Because there was nothing to be afraid of, and it was useful for Dumbledore to understand that from the very beginning. The feast appeared. Harry looked at the food and thought about Asgardian feast tables and decided that while the scale was smaller, the enthusiasm was comparable. He ate, and answered questions, and listened, and occasionally asked questions of his own in the way he'd always done, directly, without the polite preamble that people often used as a way of hedging. "What's Quidditch like to play?" he asked the table generally. This produced a response of such volume and enthusiasm that the Hufflepuff table looked over, and by the end of the feast Harry had received 5 different opinions about the best broomstick model, a detailed account of the Gryffindor team's last 3 seasons, and a genuine debate about whether a seeker could be effective if they played aggressively rather than reactively, into which Harry introduced the observation that in his experience the best way to catch something was to make it come to you rather than chasing it, which Fred and George found extremely interesting for reasons they didn't immediately explain. After dinner, after the moving staircases, which Harry liked for their honesty about the building's nature, it was a magical place and the stairs reflected that, and he didn't understand why the other students were frustrated rather than delighted. After the portrait of the fat lady and the Gryffindor common room with its deep red and gold and its enormous fireplace, after all of that, Harry sat in his dormitory on his assigned bed and listened to his 4 dormitory mates settle in around him. Ron in the next bed, already talking. Neville Longbottom at the far end, quiet, the kind of quiet that was trying not to take up too much space, which Harry recognized as something worth paying attention to. Dean Thomas and Seamus Finnegan in the middle, easy with each other already. It was not uncomfortable. It was not Asgard, but it was not uncomfortable. The room had the quality of a place that many people had lived in before, and that history was warm rather than crowded. He put his hand in his pocket and touched the wand, 11.5 inches, Thunderbird feather, would that have been struck by lightning, and felt it respond the way it always did, like recognition. Then he put his hand on the photograph in his other pocket. James and Lily on their wedding day, laughing. He looked at it in the low light of the dormitory and thought about the ruined house in Godric's Hollow, which he'd never seen but which existed in his imagination as a specific kind of darkness, the darkness of something that was supposed to end a story and didn't. He thought about Thor finding him in the rubble and making the decision that no one else had made and carrying him home. He thought about what home meant when you had two of them. He put the photograph on the nightstand, where he could see it. "Is that your parents?" Ron asked. He hadn't meant to look but he had, and he had the grace to look slightly abashed about it. "Yes," Harry said. Your mum looks like a laugh." Harry looked at the photograph. Lily Potter, mid-laugh, red hair moving, James's hand in hers. "I think she probably was," he said. Ron nodded, with the thoughtfulness of someone who'd grown up in a large family and understood something about love and loss being the same shape. He didn't say anything more, which was exactly the right call. Harry turned off his light and lay back. He thought about Thor's expression on the platform, the raised hand, the stoic face, the 20-second range, and felt the warmth of it from hundreds of miles away, undiminished by distance. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. He closed his eyes and slept. The first week of classes was, on balance, illuminating in the way that new places are when you're paying attention. Charms with Flitwick, who was small and enthusiastic and had an approach to teaching that Harry liked because it prioritized genuine understanding over rote execution. When they got to the Wingardium Leviosa lesson, feathers, wands, the standard verbal wrist combination, Harry did it on the first attempt, which was not remarkable, except that he did it without the wand, realized halfway through that he'd reached instinctively and the wand was still in his pocket, used it anyway to fit convention, and noticed that with the wand the movement was more precise and with his bare hand it had been slightly more powerful. He made a note of this. Hermione, beside him, had it on her second attempt and glowed quietly about it, which Harry found entirely reasonable given that it was her second day of formal magical education and she was already operating at a competent level by instinct alone. "You did it wandlessly first," she said, low, after class. "Old habit," Harry said. "Can you teach me that?" He looked at her. She had the expression of someone who genuinely wanted to learn something for the sake of knowing it, not for any surrounding reason, and that quality was rare enough that he responded to it directly. "Eventually. When you've got the wand mechanics more established. You need the framework first or the wandless version has nothing to build against." She nodded, with the decisiveness of someone receiving information and filing it correctly. "Loki's methodology." "Essentially. I really would like to read his papers," she said. "I'll write home tonight," he said. Transfiguration was McGonagall, who was exactly as precise and demanding as advertised, with a satisfaction in the precise execution of a spell that Harry recognized as a kindred quality. She cared about getting things right not because of the evaluation but because wrong was inefficient and imprecise. She turned her desk into a pig and back with the economy of someone for whom the motion and the magic were completely unified, and Harry thought, that's what Loki looks like when he casts. His transfiguration of the matchstick, needle, same standard first exercise, happened with a completeness that made McGonagall pause. Not dramatic. The matchstick became a needle from one moment to the next, no gradual shimmer, no visible transition stage. Just matchstick, then needle, silver and exact. McGonagall looked at him. He looked back. "Did you," she said carefully, "do that with or without the incantation?" "Without," he said. "I can do it with if you prefer." She looked at him for another moment with the expression she would wear throughout his time at Hogwarts, a careful balance between genuine admiration and the pedagogical recognition that some students need different discipline rather than more. "You'll do the exercises as set," she said. "But stay after next class. I have questions." "I have answers," he said, which was what he'd said to Hermione, and which was simply true. Potions was Snape. The dungeon was cold and smelled of something complex and permanent, and Snape moved through it with the ownership of someone in their element. He was not what Harry had expected and entirely what he'd expected simultaneously. The intelligence was immediately apparent, the way he set up the lesson was elegant, the sequence deliberate, building understanding through structure rather than explanation. He was a good teacher, Harry suspected, under the performance. The performance was the problem. Potter, Snape said, on his first sweep of the classroom, stopping at Harry's bench. Odinson, Harry said, pleasantly. The pause was small but real. What is the difference, Snape said, between monkshood and wolfsbane? Standard first lesson test, designed to establish dominance through publicly demonstrating ignorance. Harry had read every Hogwarts standard text 3 times, plus supplementary materials. They're the same plant, he said. Also called aconite. Generally used in potion brewing for wolfsbane and several sleeping draughts. The distinction in names is regional and historical, not botanical. Snape looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in his face, not in his expression exactly, but behind it. The black eyes dropped to Harry's for just a second and then back to General, and then he moved down the row. Later in the class, the standard instructions on the board, the students attempting the simple identification potion, Harry worked with the efficient focus he brought to everything practical, moving through the ingredient preparation with the knife work he'd learned in Asgard's kitchens, which he'd spent 3 summers working alongside the palace cooks because he'd wanted to understand it and the cooks were interesting people. Hermione beside him was working with precise speed. Ron across the table was slightly behind and not quite as precise, but genuinely trying. Snape stopped behind Harry. You're chopping the valerian too finely, Snape said. Harry looked at the chopped valerian. It was the correct fineness per the instructions on the board. He knew this because he'd read the instructions carefully and matched the recommended cut precisely. He looked up. The board says medium fine, he said, mildly. Not challenging. Just accurate. The board, Snape said, describes what the textbook says. I'm telling you what produces the correct consistency. Harry looked at the board. Looked at the valerian. Looked at Snape. You could update the board, he said. If the textbook's wrong. Another pause. Longer. Stir counterclockwise, Snape said, and moved on, and Harry was almost certain that underneath the severeness something was doing something complicated and involuntary in the man's expression. Ron whispered, nobody talks to him like that. Like what? Harry said honestly. Like he's just, a person who said a wrong thing. He is a person who said a wrong thing. Yeah, but, the valerian is medium fine, Harry said, and the potion is going to come out correctly. He stirred, counterclockwise, which was actually the right call, and the potion's color shifted exactly as the textbook described. See. Ron looked at it. Looked at Snape's back. Looked at Harry. I want to be you when I grow up, he said. You're already you, Harry said, which was so completely earnest that Ron blinked and then laughed. History of Magic was Binns, and Binns was, well, Binns was a ghost, which was interesting in concept, and a teacher whose relationship to the animation of his subject matter had apparently concluded at approximately the same time as his life. Harry sat through the first half of the lecture taking notes because the material was actually genuinely interesting if you stripped away the delivery, and then spent the second half quietly helping Neville Longbottom, who was sitting nearby and who was clearly struggling not with the material but with the basic organizational anxiety of someone who hadn't yet found the system that worked for them. Neville was, Harry had concluded, the most consistently underestimated person in Gryffindor Tower. He was nervous and occasionally clumsy and spent considerable energy apologizing for taking up space, but underneath that was a genuine mind and a warmth that was bone deep, and every time Harry had watched him interact with his plants, herbology was Neville's class in the way that training with Sif was Harry's, the nervousness fell away and what was left was someone completely in their element. Harry had a particular sensitivity to people finding their element, having grown up watching it in Asgard's warriors. Your cross-referencing system is working against you, Harry said quietly, during Bin's drone about the giant wars of 1346. You're putting the dates in one column and the events in another and then having to track back and forth. Try integrating them. Neville looked at his notes. Looked at Harry. He reorganized 3 lines and something clicked into place in his expression. Oh. Your memory is actually quite good, Harry said. It's the structure that's getting in the way. Neville stared at him. How do you know my memory's good? You remembered every student's name after the sorting. I watched. You weren't looking at anyone particularly carefully, but at breakfast you had all 40 names. That's good working memory. Neville sat with this for a moment. It was the sitting that happened when someone receives accurate information about themselves that they haven't previously been allowed to believe. Nobody's ever, he stopped. I'm just usually bad at, you're not bad at it, Harry said. You have a system that doesn't match your brain. Different problem. Binns droned on. Around them, half the class was asleep or very close. Neville quietly reorganized the rest of his notes, and the improvement was immediate and visible, and he worked through the rest of the lecture with something in his posture that hadn't been there before, a fraction more vertical, a fraction less apologetic. Harry noted it and said nothing more about it. The flying lesson was on Thursday afternoon, clear sky, Madam Hooch on the pitch with 20 school brooms lined up. Harry stood beside his broom and looked at it with genuine curiosity. He'd seen them in Loki's mirror, had been told about Quidditch, but this was a school broom and it showed its age. Scarred handle, twigs not entirely aligned. Up, said Madam Hooch, and Harry said it with the others. His broom shot up. He caught it. Around him the results were mixed, Ron's up immediately, several others slow, Neville's shooting up and smacking his palm hard enough that he winced. Hermione's cooperating but with the slightly doubtful quality of something that was technically compliant. Madam Hooch talked them through mounting. Harry mounted. The broom moved under him with the particular character of something that had been ridden by many students over many years. It had opinions, and they weren't all consistent, and working with it would require adjustment. He made the adjustment in the first 3 seconds, redistributing his weight, and the broom settled. Then Neville, white-knuckled and clearly already tipping forward, shot into the air. Harry moved before Hooch did. He was off the ground and vertical in one motion, not riding the broom up but boosting himself with Seer, the broom trailing his momentum, and he was level with Neville in 2 seconds. Neville was 8 feet up and still accelerating, the broom bucking, his grip wrong, his weight forward. Let the broom balance you, Harry said, close enough that Neville could hear over the wind. You're fighting it. Stop fighting. I can't, you can. Your grip is too tight. Loosen it. If I loosen it, I'm right here, Harry said, and meant it in the way that required no elaboration. Neville's grip loosened by approximately 20%. The broom immediately stabilized. His trajectory flattened. He went from 8 feet to 9 feet in a controlled arc and then leveled off, and was hovering, and was alive, and was blinking down at the ground with the expression of someone who has just discovered they can do something they were certain they could not. Good, Harry said. Neville looked at him. You're flying, he said, with a sort of distant wonder. You're not, you let go of the broom. Harry looked at his broom. He'd let go of it at some point, was hovering about 8 feet up with no contact with anything, broom floating beside him. He picked it back up. Force of habit, he said. Below, Madam Hooch was looking up at them with the expression of someone whose Thursday afternoon lesson had taken an unexpected direction. Draco Malfoy, somewhere in the loose cluster of students still on the ground, said, in a carrying voice, did he just, without the broom? Harry came back down. The broom descent was deliberate now, controlled. He landed beside Neville's broom, which had also descended at a moderate pace as Neville leaned carefully back and redirected. Madam Hooch looked at him with gold-flecked eyes that were too sharp to be just a flying teacher's. That, she said, was not the exercise. No, Harry agreed. But Longbottom's safe. A pause. 5 points to Gryffindor, she said, for quick thinking. She looked at him steadily. Don't do it without the broom again in my class. Of course, Harry said. The lesson resumed. Harry paid more attention to the broom after that, and found it genuinely interesting. The magic woven into the wood was the wizarding tradition, purely, a different flavor from anything he worked with daily, and understanding it by feel was a good exercise. By the end of the session he was flying the school broom with a competence that Madame Hooch, at the end of class, described as exceptional natural ability, and which Harry privately attributed to having spent a decade flying considerably higher and faster in non-standard ways. Ron, landing beside him, was flushed and grinning. You weren't kidding about flying without the broom. I said I had a different method. That's not a different method, that's a completely different thing. Ron's voice was caught between awe and laughter. My dad works at the ministry. He's going to want to meet you very badly. I'd be glad to meet him, Harry said, and meant it. It was after dinner on Friday, 1 week complete, the common room warm and busy, Fred and George in one corner conducting what was clearly an experiment that their identical expressions of careful innocence confirmed was unauthorized, that Harry finally met Quirrell properly. He'd seen him at meals, at the staff table, the defense against the dark arts professor, slight, with the stutter and the distinctive purple turban. He moved through Hogwarts with the particular gait of someone carrying something they were trying not to let show, and Harry had noticed this from the first day and filed it away without drawing conclusions yet. Quirrell stopped him in the corridor outside the common room with the air of someone who had been working up to this. Oh. Harry, Mr. Odinson. Just the person, I wanted to say, we'll be covering some quite fascinating material this year in defense, I do hope you'll, he was looking at Harry's face. Everyone looked at Harry's face, specifically at the scar, but Quirrell's way of looking was different from the others. Less wonder. More something else. A sharp, focused attention that was at odds with the stutter and the nervous presentation, visible only for a moment before the stutter reasserted itself and he finished the sentence about fascinating material. Harry felt the scar prickle. Not pain, he hadn't had pain from the scar in years, not since Loki had begun working on the Horcrux fragment and it had quieted. But a kind of alertness. A recognition. He looked at Quirrell with steady green eyes. I look forward to it, Professor, he said. Quirrell smiled. Harry smiled back. And under the social surface of the exchange was something else. Quirrell had felt it too, the prickle, the recognition, because for just one moment something moved in his face that was not Quirrell's nervousness or Quirrell's mild manner or the stutter, something that looked through Quirrell's eyes from a place considerably further back. It saw Harry. Harry held its gaze. Then it was gone, and Quirrell was just a nervous professor in a purple turban, and Harry said something pleasant and moved on, and in his head, very quietly, he thought, so that's where you are. He went back to the common room. He sat down by the fire, pulled out his homework, and began writing a letter to Loki, who would want to know that the fragment in Harry's scar had recognized the fragment in Quirrell, and that Voldemort, whatever he was, shadow and echo and remnant, had looked through his professor's eyes at Harry Potter and found something he had not expected. Harry wrote the letter, sealed it, and went to find Hedwig. She was in the Ollery, pristine and imperious among the school owls, and she took the letter with the air of someone doing a significant favor and launched herself into the Scottish night without ceremony. Harry watched her go. He leaned on the window and breathed the cold air and felt both worlds in him simultaneously, the Asgardian seer, deep and structured, and the wizarding magic, warm and responsive, and the wand in his pocket that was both and neither, and underneath all of it the faint hum of his mother's love, doing its slow and patient work. He was not afraid. He was, if anything, exactly as ready as he'd told Thor he was. He went back inside. Chapter 4, Gods Don't Hide. October arrived in Scotland the way it always did, sideways, in the form of rain that had personal opinions about windows, and wind that treated the castle's corridors as a suggestion rather than a barrier. The lake went from dark to darker. The forbidden forest became a solid wall of shadow. The ghosts, Harry noticed, seemed happier about it, drifting through walls with slightly more energy, as if the atmospheric grimness was nourishing. Harry liked October. The cold was familiar. Asgard ran cold, the kind of cold that felt like the world was paying attention, and the shortening days meant longer evenings in the Gryffindor common room with the fire going and a book in hand, which was a configuration he'd been fond of since he was 7. He'd also discovered that the covered stone corridor between the main castle and the greenhouses was excellent for early morning practice when the weather made the courtyard impractical, which Neville had discovered also, for different reasons, and which had produced an unlikely but entirely natural arrangement where Neville tended his various plants at one end of the corridor and Harry ran through his morning forms at the other end, and neither of them required conversation about it. Neville had, in the weeks since September, steadily expanded in the way that people do when someone consistently treats them as capable. Not dramatically, it wasn't a cinematic transformation, it was smaller than that, more real. He forgot to apologize for himself in a specific subset of situations. He started contributing in herbology without being called upon. He'd stopped storing his toad, Trevor, in increasingly creative places born of anxiety and started simply keeping him in his dormitory with the matter-of-fact comfort of someone who had decided that their thing was their thing. Harry hadn't done anything specific. He'd just kept treating Neville like the person he actually was, which was apparently enough to matter. Hermione, meanwhile, had found a rhythm at Hogwarts that was particular to her, operating at approximately 2 levels above the curriculum at any given moment, which the teachers received with varying degrees of equanimity. Flitwick delighted in her. McGonagall respected her. Snape graded her work correctly and spoke to her sharply, and she responded to both with the same focused attention, which was, Harry suspected, genuinely the right strategy with Snape. He had no particular mechanism for dealing with someone who was simply impervious to the performance. Loki had sent the papers Hermione requested within a week of Harry's letter, a scroll of dense theoretical work on the intersection of seer and Midgardian wand work that arrived tied to Hedwig's leg alongside a separate shorter note to Harry that said, "Tell her the argument in Section 3 is still contested. I am curious whether she agrees with my position or Frigga's." Hermione had read the papers twice, written 12 pages of notes, and come back to Harry with her assessment, which was that Loki's position in Section 3 was correct but missing a step. Harry had written this back to Loki, who had replied with 2 words, interesting. Correct. After that Hermione received occasional direct correspondence from Loki, which she treated with the specific reverence reserved for academic communication with someone whose work you'd admired before you met them, and which Loki received, Harry could tell from the tone of the responses, with the particular satisfaction of someone who had found a genuinely worthy interlocutor. Ron's response to this arrangement was a look of profound relief at not being required to participate in it. The trouble with Quirrell started the 3rd week of October, which was to say the thing that was always going to happen started then. The actual trouble had started the 1st week of September when Harry had felt the recognition in the corridor, but recognizing a problem and the problem becoming active were different events on different timelines. Defense against the dark arts was taught in a classroom on the 3rd floor that smelled strongly of garlic, presumably a meaningful choice on Quirrell's part, though one that spoke more to his reading on the subject than his understanding of what he was actually dealing with. The class itself was disjointed in a specific way, useful information sitting alongside information that felt like misdirection, which Harry paid attention to because the choice of what not to teach someone was often more diagnostic than what you did. The curriculum this year was beginning defensive magic, knockback jinxes, basic shield charms, introductory nonverbal techniques that most first-years wouldn't touch for a year or 2. Harry worked through all of it with the same patient engagement he brought to every class, doing it correctly per the course requirements and noting privately where his own integrated approach produced different results. What he was actually doing in defense, underneath the coursework, was watching Quirrell. Not constantly. Not obviously. But with the particular kind of peripheral attention he'd learned from years of sparring with Loki, who could do 17 things at once and expected you to track at least 4 of them. Quirrell moved through the classroom with the nervous effect that was his dominant register, but the effect had seams in it, moments where the stutter slipped or the hand steadied or the eyes lost their slightly unfocused quality and became briefly sharp and directed in a way that was completely inconsistent with the mild defense professor they were pointed at you from. Harry tracked these moments. He was building a map. What he'd told Loki in the letter after the corridor encounter was confirmed and deepened by 6 weeks of classroom observation. Quirrell was compromised. Not possessed, not entirely, there was too much Quirrell still present for full possession, but shared, in the way that a building is shared when something very large moves in and the original occupants are still technically there but their lives have rearranged around the new presence completely. Voldemort, or the piece of him that existed, dark, persistent, shaped like a hunger, had found Quirrell in some corner of the world and moved into the space his desperation had made, and now they occupied the same body with the same relationship as a parasite and a host, and Quirrell's particular self was slowly being compressed into whatever corner remained. Harry found this more sad than threatening, which was not the response the situation was designed to produce. He also found it, in the specific sense Loki had always meant the word, interesting. "You're watching Quirrell," Hermione said. It was a Saturday, early November, the library, the specific corner table that had become their established territory because it had good light and was far enough from Madame Pance's desk to permit quiet conversation. Ron was doing homework 3 books deep and making the face he made when the homework was taking longer than he'd budgeted for. Harry looked up from his notes. "What makes you say that?" "Because in every class you do the work correctly and spend the rest of the time looking at him in the way you look at things when you're building an understanding of them." She said it simply, the way she said things she was certain of. "What are you looking for?" Harry thought about how to answer. He trusted Hermione, had trusted her since approximately the 2nd hour on the train, which was faster than he usually reached that conclusion, but she was the kind of person who made the calibration easy by being exactly what she appeared to be. He also trusted Ron, whose fundamental decency was as legible as a clear sky. But Voldemort was not a small matter to put on other people. "Something's wrong with him," Harry said. "Not illness. Something else. I'm trying to understand what it is before I do anything about it." Hermione looked at him steadily. "Wrong how?" "He's not alone in his own body," Harry said. "There's something else sharing the space." She took this in. She started, and then stopped, and thought for a moment. "That's consistent with certain dark magic traditions. Partial possession. There are accounts of it it's not common in wizarding literature but it's not unknown." She looked at the table, working it out. "Could it be related to?" "Yes," Harry said. A pause. "Oh," Hermione said quietly. "That's what's on the 3rd floor." Harry looked at her. "Explain that." "There's something on the 3rd floor that Dumbledore's been guarding all year," she said. "I've been researching it. The 3-headed dog, I found a reference to the Philosopher's Stone in a restricted catalogue. I had to read it backwards because there's a minor obfuscation charm on it but nothing that accounts for someone reading from the right angle, and it mentions a stone capable of producing the elixir of life, and Nicholas Flamel, the stone is bait," Harry said. She blinked. "Bait?" "If Voldemort wanted a body, a real body, not a borrowed one, the elixir of life would be the most direct route." He leaned back. "And if Dumbledore wanted Voldemort to come to him rather than rebuilding quietly somewhere he couldn't track, making the stone known enough to find but protected enough to seem worth taking is exactly the kind of thing you'd do." Hermione stared at him. "Dumbledore put the stone here on purpose, knowing someone would try to steal it?" "I think Dumbledore does most things on purpose," Harry said, in the measured tone he'd been using for the headmaster since September. "The question is always whose purpose." Ron had looked up from his homework at some point during this exchange and was now staring at them both. "Sorry," he said. Are we talking about what I think we're talking about?" "Voldemort," Harry said, plainly, because he agreed with Loki's position on being theatrically afraid of syllables. Ron winced instinctively, the trained flinch that the wizarding world had built around the name through 2 decades of purposeful fear. Then he straightened slightly. "Right. Yes. Okay." He breathed out. "And we're just talking about this like it's a problem with a shape," Harry said. "That's what it is. A problem with a shape means you can understand the shape, and if you understand the shape you can work with it. He looked at Ron steadily. Being afraid of the name makes you afraid before there's anything to be afraid of. That's giving him power he hasn't earned yet. Ron was quiet for a moment. Then, you sound like, is that Asgardian philosophy or is that just you? Bit of both, Harry said. Right. Ron picked up his quill. Put it down again. So what are we doing about it? Harry looked at him. The we was entirely natural, entirely Ron. He'd adopted Harry without ceremony on the train and the adoption had been, it turned out, entirely mutual and entirely permanent. We're watching, Harry said. For now. Understanding before acting. Loki's been in contact with some people in the wizarding world, independently of Dumbledore, who have information about Voldemort's methods. Until I know more, watching is the right move. And Dumbledore? Dumbledore will watch us watching, Harry said. That's fine. He's not the problem. He's not the problem, Ron repeated, with the tone of someone checking that the sentence was complete. He's a complication, Harry amended. Different category. Hermione had been writing something while they talked, quick and neat, and she put her quill down. I'm going to research the Philosopher's Stone protections, she said. The specific enchantments used to guard it. If I know what's between here and the stone, we'll have more complete information. How are you going to research the specific enchantments? She looked at him with the expression she wore when she'd already worked this out. Fluffy, the three-headed dog, was brought in by someone. Hagrid, probably, it seems like his area of interest. The other protections will be from the professors, each contributing something in their area of expertise. If I research each professor's specific field at the advanced level, I can make educated assessments about what they likely used. She paused. It's logical. Harry looked at her for a moment. You've already started, he said. I started the day after I heard about the restricted third-floor corridor. Harry and Ron exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation about Hermione Granger, which landed somewhere between admiration and being slightly glad she was on their side. November brought two things, Quidditch season and an altercation with Draco Malfoy that resolved the question of Harry's place in the former. The altercation was not the one most people expected. There was no dramatic confrontation in a corridor, no escalating insult exchange. It was simpler. Malfoy, in a moment of habitual cruelty with an audience, made a specific remark about Neville's broomstick during their first flying practice of the term. The remark was petty and precise, aimed at the thing most likely to sting, delivered with the casualness of someone who had been doing this to people for so long it had stopped requiring thought. Neville didn't flinch, exactly. He'd gotten harder to dent in the last 2 months. But something in his shoulders did something. Harry, who had been at the far end of the pitch, was beside Malfoy before Malfoy had finished the sentence. He didn't say anything threatening. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at Malfoy with the kind of steady patience that, he'd learned this from Sif, communicated to people at a level below language that you were the more dangerous thing in the room and were choosing not to demonstrate it. You did that, Harry said, because you thought it was safe. Because he's Neville and you don't think Neville matters enough to worry about. Malfoy blinked. I know what you were doing. Harry's voice was completely even. I want you to understand something. Everyone in this castle matters. You matter. Neville matters. And if you make someone feel small because you can, because nothing stops you, then the only thing you've demonstrated is that you need other people to be smaller than you to feel your own size. He looked at Malfoy with those steady green eyes. You're smarter than that. Stop proving otherwise. The pitch was very quiet. Madame Hooch, at the far end, was watching but hadn't moved. Several students were pretending not to listen with varying degrees of success. Malfoy looked at Harry. He was doing the thing Harry had seen him do in the train compartment, running through responses, finding none that gave him the purchase he needed. The anger was real but the certainty was gone, and without certainty Malfoy's social machinery had very little to operate on. You've got a problem with me, Malfoy said, finally. I don't have problems with people, Harry said. I have observations about behavior. This was one. He picked up his broom from where it had been floating at his elbow. The behavior can change. The observation was specific to the behavior, not to you. He flew up to starting height and left Malfoy standing on the ground with an expression that was complicated in 4 different directions simultaneously. Ron, appearing beside Harry at altitude, said, "You know that made him either your worst enemy or someone who's going to spend the rest of the year thinking about what you said." "Could be both," Harry said. "Yeah," Ron said. "Could be both." Wood found him after practice. Oliver Wood was the Gryffindor Quidditch captain, a 6th year who cared about Quidditch the way some people cared about theology, as a complete organizing principle, and who had been watching Harry ride the school broom with an expression of barely contained excitement that Harry had noticed around week 4 of term and filed under incoming. "I need to ask you something," Wood said, walking alongside Harry off the pitch. "Seeker," Harry said. Wood stopped. "How did you've been watching me fly for 4 weeks with an expression like you'd solved the problem," Harry said. "And your team lost its Seeker last year." Loki's notes were thorough. Wood blinked. Then he did what Harry found he did well, which was recover quickly and stay on point. "You're the best natural flyer I've seen in 6 years here. Better on a school broom than half the dedicated flyers I've seen on proper Nimbus models. If I put you on a good broom, I'd need to try it first," Harry said. "I'm used to flying differently. The broom riding is an adjustment." "One practice session," Wood said, with the certainty of someone who was offering terms and knew the terms were good. "If you can't find the snitch faster than a trained I can track, I'll drop the subject entirely." "All right," Harry said. They practiced the next morning, before breakfast, just the 2 of them. Wood produced a Nimbus 2000 from the equipment room, sleek, perfectly balanced, the quality of it immediately apparent when Harry mounted and felt the broom respond to his weight like a conversation rather than an obligation, and released a snitch at the far end of the pitch. Harry found it in 45 seconds. Not because he was looking for it with his eyes, he was, technically, but that wasn't the primary method. He reached for it with the wizarding magic, which responded to magical objects, and the snitch's enchantments lit up in his perception like a candle in a dark room, precise and specific, and he was pointing before his visual system had confirmed the location. Wood caught the 45 seconds on his watch and stared at it. "You weren't looking," he said. "I was looking with different things," Harry said. "You were, you used magic to find it." "Everything about Quidditch uses magic," Harry said reasonably. "The brooms, the balls, the goals. I'm using the same magic the enchantments run on to locate an object made of that magic. I'm not doing anything the game doesn't already contain." Wood thought about this. "Madam Hooch," he said slowly, "is going to have thoughts." "The rules don't specify the method," Harry said. "Only the objective." Wood looked at the watch again. 45 seconds. He looked at Harry. "You're on the team," he said, with the conviction of someone who has made a decision they are extremely at peace with. "I thought I might be," Harry said. McGonagall, when Wood told her, produced the same expression she'd worn in Transfiguration when Harry had transformed the matchstick, careful admiration balanced against pedagogical responsibility, and said, "Youngest Seeker in a century, minimum," in the tone of someone quietly delighted with this fact and doing a reasonable impression of someone who isn't. The Nimbus 2000 arrived the next morning at breakfast, carried by 6 owls. Ron choked on his porridge. Hermione looked over from her book with the expression of someone who had expected this outcome approximately 3 days ago. Neville, sitting beside Harry, said, "That's brilliant," with complete sincerity. Fred and George, arriving late, stopped at the end of the table and looked at the broom and then at each other and then at Harry with the expressions of people who had just expanded their plans considerably. Harry ran his hand down the broom's handle. It was genuinely excellent. He thought about telling Thor, and about Thor's response, which he could already construct: enormous, delighted, something thrown in enthusiasm, probably Sif's dignified exasperation in the background. He wrote the letter that evening. The reply arrived in 2 days. Thor's handwriting was large and enthusiastic and occupied about 3 times more parchment than the words required, and it contained, at the bottom, a sketch of Mjolnir with a little broom drawn next to it and the word victory in capital letters, which was both ridiculous and entirely, irreplacably his father, and Harry looked at it for a long moment before folding it away. The mountain troll arrived on Halloween. The feast was everything it should have been, spectacular quantities of food, the great hall at its most atmospheric, the ceiling a perfect deep autumn sky. Harry was in conversation with the twins about a specific theoretical modification to the Confundus charm that they'd raised with him 2 weeks ago and which had been sitting in the back of his mind since then as a genuine puzzle, not because it was ethically comfortable, it wasn't, but because the mechanics of it were interesting. Then Quirrell came through the doors. He was running, which was already unusual. Quirrell moved with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a significant internal structural issue, and his face was pale, and he gripped the doorframe, and announced in a voice that was shaking, "Troll, in the dungeon, thought you ought to know," he fainted. Or performed fainting. Harry watched him hit the floor and noted that the performance was good, because this was the kind of detail that mattered. Dumbledore stood. Prefects organized the evacuation with the efficiency of training. The hall moved toward the dormitories in the organized chaos of 500 people being sensibly scared, and Harry was already calculating, a troll in the dungeons meant the Slytherin common room was in the dungeons, which meant someone had either made an error in their planning or chosen the dungeons specifically because the troll wasn't actually the primary event. He was moving against the flow before he'd fully articulated this. "Where are you going?" Ron grabbed his arm. "Hermione wasn't at the feast," Harry said. Ron's face changed. "She's been in the bathroom all afternoon. She was crying because of what Malfoy said." "Which bathroom?" "Second floor, near the..." Harry was already moving. Ron came with him without being asked, which was entirely Ron. The second-floor girls' bathroom was a different kind of problem than it appeared. Harry felt the troll's presence before he heard it, a wrongness in the air, a smell, and underneath both a kind of magical disruption that large, highly charged creatures produced in their wake, the way a storm produces its own electromagnetic signature before the thunder. The door was already partially open, pushed from the inside, and the sounds from within were not encouraging. Harry pushed through. The troll was enormous, which was the first thing, and grey-green, and smelling of something that no combination of words adequately prepared you for, and it was in the process of methodically destroying the bathroom stalls with a club that was roughly the size of a small tree. Hermione was backed against the far wall between 2 standing sinks, arms up, wand out but frozen, not without ideas, Harry could see, but calculating frantically whether any of them would be sufficient. The troll raised its club. "Hey," Harry said. The troll turned. Its small eyes found Harry in the doorway. "Put that down," Harry said. The troll did not put it down. It swung the club at Harry, which was a predictable choice and one Harry had already moved to account for, dropping to one knee and letting the club pass overhead with about 6 inches clearance, which he accepted philosophically, and came back up inside the troll's reach. What happened next happened quickly, because Harry had been trained in both Asgardian combat, which prioritized decisive conclusion of engagements, and wandless spellwork, which operated at the speed of intention, and the combination of these things with 11.5 inches of Thunderbird feather wand was the sort of thing that produced a very fast resolution to what had appeared to be a very large problem. He put his hand flat against the troll's chest, and he pushed. Not physically. He pushed with the integrated force of both systems, the raw output of the wizarding tradition amplified by the architecture of the seer, and the push didn't throw the troll so much as suggest to it with overwhelming firmness that standing there was no longer viable. The troll hit the far wall. The wall cracked. The troll made a sound that was probably the word for surprise in troll, which was also possibly the word for pain, and sat down in a pile of bathroom rubble with the slightly distant expression of something that had just received information it hadn't expected. Ron, in the doorway, said something that was mostly consonants. Hermione had her wand still up, trained on the troll, her face pale but her eyes sharp. "What," she said, "was that?" "That was faster," Harry said, than most alternatives. He looked at the troll, which was sitting in the rubble and breathing and not, currently, moving. Ron, can you do a rope jinx?
Yes, I think, do it now while it's still processing.
Ron came in and did the rope jinx with the slightly shaky hands of someone operating on adrenaline but getting the mechanics right through repetition, and the ropes appeared around the troll's wrists and it made another sound, more indignant than pained, and settled into the restraint the way things do when they've concluded that fighting is going to be more trouble than it's worth. The bathroom was very quiet.
Are you alright?
Harry asked Hermione.
Yes.
She lowered her wand. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline catching up, which was normal, and she recognized it as such and breathed through it with the methodical composure that was very specific to her. I was calculating whether I could levitate the club out of its reach before it reached me. The answer was probably not.
Probably not, Harry agreed.
You'd have gotten the club but it would have changed hands too slowly.
That's what I thought.
She looked at the troll. Looked at Harry.
You pushed it.
Yes. How hard is it to push a mountain troll?
Harder than a regular person, Harry said.
Easier than Volstagg.
Who is Volstagg?
An Asgardian warrior the size of a small building.
Good fighter.
Excellent cook. She stared at him for a moment. Then she started to say something, and the door opened, and McGonagall came through at the front of a small delegation of professors, assessed the scene in 2 seconds with the efficiency of someone who had been teaching at Hogwarts for decades and had therefore seen several configurations of disaster, and said, "Explanation."
Now.
Harry explained.
Ron explained.
Hermione explained.
The explanations were factual and relatively brief and collectively accurate, and McGonagall's expression moved through several stages during them before arriving at the stern composure of someone who has decided that the outcome justifies suspending the lecture about rule-breaking until everyone's heart rate is back to normal. Snape was among the professors. He was looking at Harry with that specific unreadable quality he deployed when something was going on underneath the surface that he wasn't going to show, which Harry had catalogued as Snape's version of complex emotion. His eyes moved from Harry to the cracked wall to the troll to the ropes, and he said nothing, and then he stepped out into the corridor, and Harry noticed, as he went, that he was favoring one leg.
Harry filed this.
Said nothing.
Dumbledore arrived last.
He came through the bathroom door with the bearing of someone who had been informed of the situation before arriving, which meant he'd been informed quickly, which meant he had very good information networks within the castle.
He looked at the troll.
He looked at Harry.
He looked at the wall.
"Good evening, Harry," he said, pleasantly.
"Professor Dumbledore," Harry said.
"That," Dumbledore said, with a gesture at the cracked wall, "is remarkable stonework.
16th century, I believe.
Held up rather well."
"I noticed that," Harry said.
A pause.
Dumbledore's eyes, blue and direct and measuring, were doing the thing they did when he was having a conversation and simultaneously having a different conversation underneath it.
A troll is a significant challenge for anyone.
You handled it with considerable assurance.
It was a problem with a shape, Harry said.
Dumbledore considered this.
Indeed.
He looked at Harry for another moment, and Harry looked back, steady, present, giving exactly what was appropriate and nothing extra, and then Dumbledore smiled, the warm and genuine smile that Harry had identified as real from the very early days, the one that wasn't entirely a mask.
5 points each to Gryffindor.
For presence of mind.
He left.
Harry watched him go, and thought about the 3rd floor, and about bait, and about the particular quality of a very old man who loved his school and his world and was certain, absolutely, architecturally certain, that he understood how things needed to work. Snape's leg was injured for 3 days. Harry confirmed this through observation and through Fred and George, who had a network of castle knowledge that was the most impressive intelligence-gathering system Harry had encountered outside of Heimdall. Snape had been to the 3rd floor on Halloween. Harry processed this information, added it to the map he was building, and sent Loki a short letter. Loki's reply came back in 24 hours,
considerably shorter than his usual responses, which meant he'd arrived quickly at a conclusion: he was bitten by the dog. He was testing the protections independently, either to ensure their integrity or to understand what he's dealing with. Either way, Snape is watching the stone for his own reasons. Whether those reasons are Dumbledore's reasons is the interesting question. Harry wrote back, "He loved my mother." Loki's reply took longer this time. When it came, it said simply, "Yes." That changes the shape of the thing considerably. Be careful with him. The Gryffindor vs Slytherin Quidditch match was the first of the season, third week of November, played on a pitch that was making its feelings about November very clear through the medium of horizontal rain. Harry flew in it with the same equanimity he flew in everything. Weather in Asgard had been significantly more dramatic than English November, involving on one notable occasion an interdimensional lightning storm that Loki had accidentally started and taken 3 days to finish, and the rain was, if anything, useful, because it pushed other flyers toward caution, and Harry found that caution was not typically his best mode. He found the snitch in 11 minutes. This was not the primary notable thing about the match, though it was notable. The primary notable thing was what happened at the 8-minute mark, when his broom began to behave. Not malfunction. Harry knew brooms, had the Nimbus 2000 thoroughly memorized by now, flew it every other day and understood its specific character and response range the way you understand a thing you work with regularly. What it did was not the broom's choice. Something external was causing it, something that worked through the broom's enchantments rather than through its mechanics. A magical interference that made the broom jerk and pitch and resist in ways that were inconsistent with the wind and with the broom's own properties. He locked his legs and rode it. The crowd reacted. He could see the shapes of people below reacting. Hermione had grabbed Ron's arm, he could see that specifically, and his broom pitched again, harder, and he locked tighter and ran a quick internal assessment of the interference while simultaneously flying the match. The interference was focused. Not ambient, not weather-related, coming from a specific direction, from the stands, from the teacher's section of the stands, from a specific person in that section who was not moving and whose eyes, Harry was nearly certain, were fixed on his broom. He looked. Snape. Still, focused, lips moving almost imperceptibly. Harry processed this in approximately 2 seconds. Snape was counterintuitive. The conclusion was that Snape was protecting the broom. The interference Harry was feeling was someone fighting against an original sabotage, and Snape's counter-hex, layered on top of the original hex, was creating the turbulence because the two spells were arguing through the enchantments. Someone else was hexing his broom. He made a calculated assessment of who that was likely to be, given the map he'd been building since September. Quirrell. He looked at Quirrell's section of the stands. He couldn't confirm visually, but the direction was consistent. He looked at Snape. He looked at his broom. And then he made the decision that was honestly the only decision he was going to make, which was to find the snitch immediately and end the match before the situation required him to handle Quirrell in public. He felt the snitch. 9 o'clock, 20 feet above the Slytherin goalposts. Moving right. He dropped into a dive, the broom fighting him still, and he held the line through the fighting, and the dive was not the standard graceful seeking arc, it was faster and more direct, and it involved redirecting the broom's resistance into momentum through a specific application of sear that was entirely invisible from the stands and which he'd worked out in theory 6 weeks ago and was now testing practically. He hit the bottom of the dive with his hand closed around the snitch. The crowd went thoroughly insane in several different directions simultaneously. He came to a stop above the pitch and held up the snitch and felt the match end around him, and then he descended, and when his feet touched the ground he turned immediately toward the stands and looked at where Quirrell had been sitting. Quirrell was gone. Snape was still there. He met Harry's eyes from across the pitch with an expression that was complex enough to require more light and time than Harry currently had. Then he stood and left. Harry stood on the pitch with the snitch in his hand and the rain coming sideways and his team descending in various states of celebration around him, and he thought, Snape is protecting me without knowing I know, and Quirrell is testing what I'll do, and Voldemort is watching through Quirrell's eyes and learning, and Dumbledore is watching all of it and building his own picture. And underneath all of that, somewhere on the other side of the Bifrost, Thor was going to hear about this match from Heimdall and be both enormously proud and mildly furious about the broom incident, in that order. Ron hit him in the shoulder with both hands. 11 minutes, he shouted, over the rain. The broom was having a moment, Harry said. The broom was. Ron couldn't finish this sentence through his own laughter and moved immediately into a more sustained celebration of the 11 minutes. Hermione arrived, hair completely plastered down, robes drenched, and said, the broom was hexed. Yes, Harry said. And counter-hexed. By 2 different people. She paused. I know who one of them was. So do I, Harry said. Did you know during the match? Yes. She considered this. And you just flew. The alternatives were less efficient, he said. She looked at him with the expression she wore when he did something that was simultaneously impressive and infuriating because it refused to give her anything to constructively criticize. You're going to be the most exhausting person I've ever been friends with, she said. Almost certainly, Harry said, entirely pleasantly. She rolled her eyes. But she was smiling, the real Hermione smile that was less frequent than it should have been and worth approximately twice its weight every time it appeared, and they walked off the pitch together in the rain. The letter from Thor arrived the morning after the match, as predicted, and it was everything Harry had expected, enormous handwriting, the pride radiating off the parchment nearly physically, and then at the bottom, in a different quality of ink that suggested it had been added after the initial letter was finished, Heimdall tells me the broom was interfered with. I am not concerned because you handled it. I am also furious about it in a way that I am setting aside because you handled it. These 2 things can be true simultaneously. When you find the person responsible, write to me. Love, your father. P.S. 11 minutes is considerably faster than the record in the Asgardian records Heimdall showed me. He seems pleased with himself about finding those records. I haven't told him that. Harry folded the letter and put it with the others, Thor's letters, accumulating in the inside pocket of his school robes, warm and heavy and constant as weather. He looked up at the great hall ceiling. Clear today, bright winter pale sky above the enchantment, the castle going about its morning business around him. He thought about the map. He thought about the stone on the 3rd floor and Quirrell moving steadily toward it and Snape watching both and Dumbledore watching all of it with the patience of someone who had decided that certain events needed to happen in a certain order and was allowing them to approach. He thought about what Loki had said, being yourself is the most difficult thing for other people to account for. They can plan around what they expect. Nobody had planned for Harry Odinson. He ate his breakfast, and answered Hermione's question about last night's charms reading, and defended Ron's position on a Quidditch rule dispute with Fred from a technical standpoint that Ron hadn't thought of but was entirely correct, and the morning went on, and the castle went on, and somewhere in the castle Quirrell went about his teaching with Voldemort behind his eyes, looking out at the school and calculating, and feeling, Harry was fairly certain, the specific frustration of something that had planned around an expected person and found someone else entirely standing where the plan expected to land. That frustration was useful. Harry intended to keep producing it. Chapter 5, The Mirror and the Flame. December came to Hogwarts the way December came to Scotland, all at once, the cold arriving not gradually but in one decisive overnight shift that converted the grounds from autumn to something considerably more serious. The lake frosted at its edges. The forbidden forest went from dark to impenetrable. The castle's stones held a chill that the fires couldn't entirely argue with, and the students responded by claiming proximity to fireplaces with the competitive urgency of people who had suddenly remembered what temperature was. Harry liked it. He ran his morning forms in the covered corridor with Neville's company until the corridor itself became too cold, and then he moved them to an unused classroom on the 4th floor that Peeves had apparently damaged badly enough some years ago that no one had gotten around to reassigning it, and the drafts through the broken window were bracing rather than prohibitive if you were moving fast enough. He kept the sessions going through December because the cold didn't bother him. Asgard's winters were significantly colder and the seer ran warmer when the air temperature dropped, which Loki had explained as the body's magical system compensating, and because the discipline of daily practice was not something he'd let slip since he was 6 years old. Hermione joined occasionally. Not for the physical work, she was less interested in combat training than in watching what Harry did and understanding it theoretically, but she came some mornings with her notes and sat in the corner working while Harry practiced, and this arrangement suited both of them. Ron came twice, tried the basic forms, decided his time was better spent on quidditch practice, and offered this assessment with the self-knowledge Harry had come to expect from him. Neville came every day. By December his forms were genuinely solid, and more importantly the posture he carried out of the sessions was different from the one he carried in. Harry hadn't designed this outcome deliberately. He'd simply made the space available and kept it consistently non-judgmental and let Neville's own natural competence do the rest. But there was something in watching it happen that he found quietly satisfying in a way that was hard to name. He wrote about it to Frigga, who would understand. Her reply came back with the directness that was her specific gift: you have your father's instinct for what people need. He never learned to use it carefully. You have. That's your own work. And then, underneath, your grandfather asks after you. He says this in the form of asking Heimdall about your academic progress. Tell him directly the next time you write. He prefers it but won't ask for it. Harry wrote to Odin that evening. Not a long letter. Odin was not a long letter person, but specific, with the details Odin actually wanted, which were less about how Harry was and more about what he was doing, because Odin understood people through their choices rather than their feelings, and knowing what Harry was choosing told him everything he needed about the rest. He got a reply in 3 days that was 4 sentences and extremely precise and contained, in its final line, something that was probably the closest Odin came to "I miss you, the ravens have been restless. They prefer when the palace is full." Harry smiled at it for a long time. The discovery of the mirror happened because of Peeves. It was 11 days before Christmas, the night before the last Hogsmeade weekend of term, and Harry was returning from the Ollery after sending Hedwig with a package for Frigga, a small carved wooden figure he'd made himself, a raven, because Frigga had expressed once that she found the palace raven somewhat imperious and he'd thought she might like a smaller and more personally scaled version. When Peeves materialized in the corridor ahead with the specific enthusiasm of a poltergeist who had found someone out after hours and was going to make the most of it. Harry looked at him. Peeves opened his mouth. "Don't," Harry said pleasantly. Peeves was not easily deterred. He was not easily deterred by anyone except the Bloody Baron and, it had emerged over the course of the term, Harry, which was something Peeves had not initially planned for and which had produced, after 2 encounters that Peeves had come off poorly from, a sort of wary professional respect. He closed his mouth. He turned sideways in the air in the manner of someone who has decided that this corridor is no longer interesting. "There's a room," Peeves said, with the air of someone trading information. "Which room?" "7th floor. Behind the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy." A pause. "Someone moved a mirror in there. Big one. Gold frame. The Bloody Baron doesn't go past the tapestry and Filch can't find it." He drifted sideways, clearly satisfied with having established his usefulness. "I would have told Dumbledore, but Dumbledore moves it anyway and I think it's more fun that someone doesn't know it's there." Harry considered this. "Why are you telling me?" Peeves grinned, which on a poltergeist was an expression that covered considerable range. "Because you're interesting," he said, which was more honest than Harry had expected from him. "And the mirror does interesting things to interesting people." He vanished, with the usual minor property damage of a door handle spinning off somewhere, leaving the corridor empty. Harry stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he went to the 7th floor. The room behind the tapestry was cold and high-ceilinged and dusty in the way of rooms that are large enough to generate their own weather. Moonlight came through a single window and lit the dust particles moving in the air like snow in still water. The room smelled of old wood and something he couldn't quite identify, not unpleasant, more like the smell of time itself, if time had a smell. The mirror stood against the far wall. It was large. Floor to ceiling, nearly, in a frame of tarnished gold that had been ornate once and was now merely impressive in the battered way that age produces. The glass was old, slightly green in the way of old glass, and across the top of the frame ran an inscription in letters that curved and interlocked, Eris stra eru oit ube kafru oit onwosi. Harry looked at the inscription. He translated it in about 10 seconds. The letters were reversed and rearranged, a basic cipher, and the result was, I show not your face but your heart's desire. He looked at the mirror. The mirror showed him standing in the room. Which was accurate. But alongside him in the mirror were people who were not there, and Harry stood very still, because this was not what he'd expected. To his left, in the mirror, was Thor. Not formal, not in armor, the Thor of the palace balcony, in shirt sleeves, one hand on Harry's shoulder in the usual way, the way that meant I'm here without requiring the words. Beside Thor was Frigga, who was looking at Harry in the mirror with the expression she wore when she was simply happy without qualification. Loki was there, slightly apart, which was accurate, with the slight reluctant warmth that Harry could read and that the mirror had apparently captured with some accuracy. Sif and the warriors three in the background, the solid constant presence of people who have been part of a life for so long they stopped being guests and became furniture, in the best sense. Odin at the edge, not central, but undeniably present. And beside Harry, on his other side, were two people he'd never met. James Potter looked like Harry grown up, the dark hair and the general shape of the face, though James was taller and carried himself with an ease that suggested the confidence had come easily rather than being built. He was grinning at something. He had the look of someone who would have liked training sessions and not been serious enough about them. Lily Potter was looking at Harry with her green eyes, his green eyes, he could see the source of them clearly, and the expression on her face was the specific expression of someone whose heart is doing something large and uncomplicated, and in the mirror she reached out and put her hand on his face the way Frigga sometimes did, the way mothers do, and her expression was, Harry breathed out slowly. He stood in front of the mirror for a long time. He was not, at his core, someone who romanticized what he didn't have. He was practical about absence, about the shape of things. He'd received the news of his parents' death at 8 with the careful honesty that Thor had brought to the telling, and he'd sat with it and understood it and filed it in the category of true things that were also painful, which was a category that existed and didn't require constant examination. He'd never pretended they weren't gone, never built the absence into something larger than it was, never let it be the defining fact of himself. But the mirror wasn't showing him an absence. It was showing him something else, a wholeness, a complete image of what surrounded him and what had made him. Both families. Both worlds. The Asgardians who had chosen him and the parents who had loved him before he was old enough to know them, and all of them together in one frame, and the thing he felt looking at it was not grief exactly. It was something that was grief and gratitude and love at the same time, in the specific configuration of those things when they're all real and all true and all operating together. He looked for a while. Then he turned away from the mirror and sat down on the cold floor with his back against the wall and looked at the ceiling. He sat there until the feeling had settled into something he could carry. Then he stood up, and looked at the mirror once more, at James Potter's grin and Lily's eyes and Thor's hand on his shoulder, and he said, quietly, to all of them, I know. And he left. He went back twice more. Not because he needed to, he knew what the mirror showed him, and what it meant, and he wasn't in danger of losing himself to it. He was not the person the mirror was designed to trap. He went back because the image of his parents standing beside his Asgardian family was something he wanted to sit with, on his own terms, on his own timeline, until he'd understood everything it was telling him. On the third visit, Dumbledore was there. Not hidden, not waiting, he was simply sitting in a chair that hadn't been there before, to one side of the mirror, reading. He looked up when Harry came in with the expression of someone who is not surprised and has arranged not to be. Harry, he said. Professor, Harry said. Sit down, if you like. Harry sat down on the floor, same as the previous visits, back against the wall, because it was his habitual position in this room and he wasn't going to change it because of an audience. Dumbledore looked at him with those blue eyes that were warm and sharp simultaneously,
a combination Harry had been reading carefully for 3 months. "You've been here before," Dumbledore said. "3 times, Harry said. "This is the 3rd. "What does it show you?" Harry considered. He could decline to answer, it was a personal thing and Dumbledore was not owed it. But there was something in the directness of the question, in the fact that Dumbledore was asking rather than extracting, that made him decide the honest answer was more useful. "My family," he said. "Both families. Together." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "Both," he said. "The Asgardians who raised me and the parents I was born to," Harry said. "All of them in the same image." Dumbledore looked at the mirror. He had the expression of someone revising a calculation, not dramatically, but the small recalibration of a very good mind encountering information that adjusts rather than overturns. "Most people," he said, "see the mirror and wish. They see what they most deeply want that they do not have." "I know what it's supposed to do," Harry said. "The inscription." "Yes." A pause. "And what does it mean for you that it shows you all of them together?" Harry looked at him steadily. Dumbledore was smart enough that the question wasn't idle. He was investigating something, trying to understand what Harry's deepest desire was, because understanding that was the key to understanding what Harry could be used for, or protected from, or directed toward. It was a gentle extraction in the shape of a kind conversation. Harry answered it honestly anyway, because honesty was more disorienting to this kind of extraction than deflection. "It means my desire is not for something I don't have," Harry said. "It means both families are real to me. The mirror is just showing me what's true." He paused. "The people in it are already in my life. I'm not longing for them. I know where they are." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in his face that was not quite what Harry expected, not the recalculation, something underneath it, something older. "You are," he said, carefully, "not what the mirror usually produces." "No," Harry said. "Most people see something they want desperately. They stand here and look and cannot pull themselves away. The mirror shows desire and creates more of it, a feedback loop. You've been here 3 times and each time you've left." "I came to understand," Harry said. "Not to want." Dumbledore was quiet again, and this time the quiet was different. It was the quiet of a very old man having a thought that surprised him. "May I ask you something directly?" "Yes." "What do you know," Dumbledore said, "about why you came to Hogwarts? What you were told about yourself, about the wizarding world, about what is expected of you?" Harry looked at him. Steady. Giving the look all the honesty it deserved. "I know about the prophecy," he said. "I know Voldemort is not entirely gone. I know there's a piece of him in this castle. I know," and he watched Dumbledore very carefully here, "that you put the Philosopher's Stone here specifically." Dumbledore's expression did not change. He was too experienced for that. But something in the set of his hands on the arms of his chair shifted slightly, the way the body responds to things the face is too disciplined to show. "I know," Harry continued, "that you had a plan for me before I was old enough to have one for myself. I know you put me on a doorstep in November and wrote a letter and expected that 11 years later a specific kind of person would arrive at this school." He paused. "I understand why you made those choices. I don't entirely agree with them. But I understand them." The room was very quiet. "You are," Dumbledore said, after a moment, "considerably more, I had expected you to be, damaged." Harry said, without heat. "Humble. Uncertain about yourself." A pause. "I expected someone who needed guidance," Dumbledore said, and he said it with the honesty of someone who respects the person they're being honest with, which raised him in Harry's estimation by something measurable. "I had anticipated being necessary in a specific way." "You can be necessary," Harry said. "Not in that way. But in others." He looked at the headmaster, at the old face, the remarkable mind behind it, the genuine love for this world that powered the architecture of all the careful choices. You care about the wizarding world. About its people. About the students in this castle. Very much, Dumbledore said quietly. Then help me understand it, Harry said. Not as a weapon. Not as the boy who lived. As someone who is going to be part of this world and wants to understand what that means. He looked at Dumbledore directly. I'm going to deal with Voldemort. Not because a prophecy tells me to. Because he killed my parents and tried to kill me, and because the things he believes and does are wrong and I'm in a position to do something about them. Those are my reasons. They're sufficient. Dumbledore looked at him. The blue eyes were very clear in the moonlit room. And if I told you, he said, that it's more complicated than that? That there are factors I have not yet shared? I'd say there are also factors you don't yet know, Harry said. And that we'd probably both do better being honest about what we have than strategic about what we're keeping. He paused. If you want to start, I'll start. I'll tell you what I know about the Horcruxes. The word landed in the room. Dumbledore went very still. He was quiet for 30 seconds. Then, for the first time in the conversation, his expression showed something unguarded, the genuine, unmediated response of someone who has been planning around an unknown variable and has just been told the variable is known. How, he said. My uncle researched it, Harry said. Loki. He's thorough. He knew about the soul fragment in my scar before I started school. He watched Dumbledore carefully. You also know. I suspected, Dumbledore said. I had not confirmed it. It's confirmed. And Loki believes it can be destroyed without destroying me. He kept his voice steady because the information was factual and deserved a factual delivery. The protection my mother left in me has been working on it for 10 years. It's significantly weakened. Loki's working on the mechanism for the rest. Dumbledore was looking at him with an expression that Harry had not seen on him before, not the warm twinkle, not the careful assessment, but something much simpler. Something that was in the neighborhood of awe and was clearly uncomfortable wearing that particular face. Harry, he said. And his voice, for the first time since Harry had known him, was simply an old man's voice. I had intended, there was a plan, I know about the plan, Harry said gently. It required me to die. The word sat between them. Dumbledore did not deny it. I'm not going to, Harry said. I understand why you thought it was necessary. Loki's worked out an alternative. And I'd like to work with you rather than around you, if that's on offer. He stood up. Looked at the mirror once more, the whole family, both families, complete. But I'm not going to be managed. I'm not going to be the weapon you built. I'm going to be myself, and that's going to be sufficient. He looked at Dumbledore. Is that something you can work with? Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he set down his book. He stood. He looked at the mirror, and whatever the mirror showed him was its own private thing, but it moved through his face in a way that was complex and old and possibly the most honest thing Harry had seen from him. Yes, he said quietly. I believe it is. Harry nodded. Good. He turned toward the door. And Professor, move the mirror somewhere less accessible. Quirrell knows about it. He left Dumbledore in the moonlit room, and the door closed behind him, and somewhere in the castle the old man stood alone with the mirror and the particular weight of a plan that had met reality and found reality considerably larger than the plan had accounted for. He told Ron and Hermione the next morning. Not all of it, not the Horcrux, not yet, not in the common room over breakfast with other people nearby, but the broad shape of the conversation, the mirror, Dumbledore. Ron listened with the focused attention he brought to things that mattered. Hermione listened and asked precise questions. He confirmed the plan involved your death, she said, at the end, in a voice that was very controlled. Not confirmed. He didn't deny it. That's the same thing.
Her jaw had a quality to it that Harry recognized as Hermione Granger being furious in a way that had not yet found its outlet. He planned for an 11-year-old to, he thought it was necessary, Harry said. Not excusing it. Contextualizing it. And he didn't know there was an alternative. Now he does. That doesn't, she stopped. Breathed. It's not acceptable regardless of whether there's an alternative. No, Harry said. It's not. Are you angry? Ron asked, watching him. Harry thought about it honestly. Not in a way that needs to go anywhere, he said. Dumbledore made choices I wouldn't make. He made them because he was certain and he stayed certain too long, and it's a human mistake. A serious one. But he's capable of change. He looked at them both. I'd rather have him as an ally who's been wrong than an opponent who's powerful and not listening. Ron and Hermione looked at each other. That's, Ron said, very mature. Loki would say it's strategic, Harry said. What would Thor say? Harry considered. That punching Dumbledore wouldn't help, but the option is there if I change my mind. Ron's laugh was sudden and loud enough that 3 nearby Gryffindors looked over. Hermione's was quieter but genuine, which meant it was the better one. January brought the particular cold clarity that follows Christmas, the castle emptier during the break and then suddenly full again, and with the new term came something that Harry had been expecting since November, Quirrell's transition from caution to action. He felt it in the quality of the magic coming off the man in class. Felt it in the particular way the scar on his forehead responded when Quirrell was in the room, not pain, still not pain, but a recognition that had shifted register. Something was accelerating. Whatever timeline Voldemort had operating through Quirrell was moving into its active phase. Loki had written, in January's first letter, the other Horcruxes are objects. I have identified 6 likely categories. Do not pursue them this year, your immediate concern is the one in the castle. The stone will be the attempt. When he moves, it will be soon, and it will be because something has changed in his calculation. Watch for what changes. What changed was subtle. Harry only caught it because he'd been watching for it, a shift in Quirrell's classroom demeanor in the second week of January, a very slight increase in the directness of his speech, the stutter appearing less frequently and with less consistency, as if Quirrell had deprioritized the performance because other things required more concentration. He told Hermione. She cross-referenced it with her independent observation of Quirrell's behavioral patterns, which she had indeed been recording because she was Hermione and this was exactly what she did, and she confirmed it. He's going to move soon, she said. Yes. Should we tell Dumbledore? Harry thought about the conversation in the mirror room, about the new arrangement, not managed, not directed, but genuinely working together. Already did, he said. Through McGonagall. She's more direct than going to Dumbledore himself. Ron looked up from his charms. What did McGonagall say? She told me that the situation was being handled by the faculty and that students should focus on their studies. Harry paused. She also looked at me for approximately 3 extra seconds before saying it, which I read as, she's taking it seriously but the official position is students stay out of it. And are we going to stay out of it? Ron asked, with the tone of someone who already knew the answer. We're going to be well informed about it, Harry said. And available if needed. That's a very diplomatic way of saying no, Hermione said. Loki's influence, Harry said. The night Quirrell made his move, Harry knew. It wasn't dramatic. There was no announcement. He woke up at 11:20 on a Tuesday in June, exams just finished, the castle wound down, with the scar prickling and the sense that something in the building had changed. Not pain. More like pressure, a directional urgency that operated below conscious thought and was the magical equivalent of a compass needle swinging. He was dressed and out of the dormitory in 4 minutes. Ron was already in the common room, his own instincts, different in kind from Harry's but not in reliability, had gotten him out of bed and downstairs. He looked at Harry when he came down the stairs and said, "It's tonight." "Yes," Harry said. Should we get Hermione? Hermione opened the girls' staircase door. I heard you get up, she said to Ron. I've been ready for 20 minutes. They looked at each other. Right, Ron said. Let's go then. The third-floor corridor had been arranged by Dumbledore with the specific architecture of someone who believed in layered challenges, each protection a test, each test designed to require different skills or knowledge to pass. Harry understood the design immediately because it was the design of someone who thought in terms of what was sufficient, and what was sufficient for most people was substantially less than what was sufficient for Harry. Fluffy was asleep. There was a harp playing nearby, quietly, which meant someone had already passed this point. Quirrell was ahead of them. Harry looked at Fluffy and thought, Loki would find this interesting and Thor would find it inadvisable, and then he moved down through the trapdoor while Hermione recorded the harp's melody for the return journey and Ron confirmed that the drop was manageable. The devil's snare was herbology. Hermione knew it in theory. The practical issue was that the light required to repel it needed to come from somewhere, and this was where Harry's dual system simply made the conventional problem a non-issue. He conjured light from his hand, clean and sustained, warm spectrum, and the plant retreated instantly with the deeply offended quality of something that had not accounted for this particular input. You're not using the wand, Hermione said. The plant responds to the light, not the methodology, Harry said. Let's go. The flying keys were Flitwick's, charmed to move in ways that were supposed to make catching the right one a sustained challenge. Harry felt the enchantments on them, the same method he used to find the snitch, reaching for the specific magical signature rather than chasing visually, and had the right key in his hand in 30 seconds. The chess set was McGonagall's and was, objectively, the most elegant of the obstacles. The pieces were enormous and clearly real in the sense that mattered, and the board was designed to force progression through genuine chess skill. Harry played chess and had since age 7, Loki had insisted on it as an exercise in positional thinking, but chess with real pieces that could damage you required a different calibration. Ron sat down at the table and looked at the board. Harry had seen Ron play chess. He'd watched him play Fred, George, Percy, his father over Christmas, and once a very ill-advised game against Hermione that Ron had won and which Hermione had been analytically honest about losing. Ron played chess the way some people sang, naturally, without having to think about it as a separate activity from thinking. Let me, Ron said, and Harry and Hermione stepped back. What happened in the next 8 minutes was the most efficient chess Harry had seen outside of Asgard, where Loki played in ways that were technically illegal but technically only if the opponent noticed, which they usually didn't. Ron moved pieces with the quiet authority of someone conducting an operation he'd been designing in the back of his mind since he sat down. The board reorganized around his strategy with the irreversibility of water finding a slope. The cost was predictable, the queen, eventually, required a specific sacrifice, and Ron had already seen it and accepted it with the equanimity of someone who understands that winning sometimes has a price and the price here was acceptable. He made the move. Go, he said. I've got it. Ron, Hermione started. I'm fine. It's a chess queen. She'll stun me. He looked at Harry. Go. Harry looked at his friend. He thought about the same thing he always thought about when people showed you who they were clearly and without equivocation, which was that you received it properly or you didn't, and receiving it properly meant trusting it. We'll be back, Harry said. Obviously, Ron said, already looking at the board. Go fix the thing. Harry and Hermione went. The next chamber was the potions riddle, a row of bottles, a logic problem, a note explaining that 7 bottles held different things and that the correct 2 could get you forward and back. Hermione read the riddle once, glanced at the bottles, and had the answer in approximately 90 seconds, which was also approximately how long Harry had needed, and they confirmed each other's conclusion. There's only enough for one person to go forward, Hermione said, looking at the smallest bottle. Harry looked at the door ahead. Felt what was beyond it, or who was beyond it, the scar pressure increasing, directed, clear. The fragment in him recognizing the source. Go back, Harry said. Get Dumbledore.
Harry, not because I can't handle it, he said, clearly, meeting her eyes. Because Dumbledore needs to see what's in that room. He needs to see the evidence himself. And someone needs to know where I am. He paused. Also Ron needs collecting. She looked at him, at the green eyes and the scar and the absolute composure of someone who was not afraid, and she made the decision that was in her character, which was to trust the accurate assessment rather than the instinct to stay. Be careful, she said. I'm always careful, he said. She gave him a very specific look. I'm always accurate, he amended. She drank her bottle and went back. Harry drank his and went forward. The chamber beyond the door was dark and tall and smelled of stone and something older, and the mirror of Erist stood at its center. Dumbledore had moved it here, which made sense as the final trap, the thing that was supposed to stop someone who had gotten past every other obstacle through desire alone. The chamber was not empty. Quirrell stood in front of the mirror with his back to Harry, his hands moving at his sides with the specific quality of someone running through calculations, and the mirror was not showing him the stone. The mirror was showing him himself, hands extended, holding a round red stone, and Quirrell was staring at his own reflection with the frustrated focus of someone who understood what they were seeing and couldn't reach it. He heard Harry come in. He turned. Without the stutter. Without the nervous quality. Without the effect, all of it dropped, and underneath was something that was Quirrell and was also something else occupying Quirrell, and the eyes were too aware to be one person's eyes. I wondered, Quirrell said, if you'd follow. I did, Harry said. Quirrell looked at him. The boy who lived, he said, and the way he said it wasn't theatrical. It was the voice of something genuinely curious. You're not what I expected. I get that a lot, Harry said. He was moving while he said it, not toward Quirrell specifically, angling to see the mirror from a different perspective, getting information while talking, the way Loki had taught him to use conversation. The mirror's frame was visible from this angle and the inscription at the top was catching the light. Stop moving, Quirrell said, and his wand came up. Harry stopped. Quirrell looked at him with the direct attention of something conducting an assessment. Not afraid. That was the interesting part, whatever was operating through Quirrell was not afraid of Harry, which meant it didn't yet understand what Harry was. It had seen the broom incident, had felt the recognition in the corridor, had some information. Not all of it. You've been watching me all year, it said. Not Quirrell's voice anymore. Deeper. The stutter gone not because it had been forgotten but because it was being shed, which meant whatever was behind Quirrell was deciding to dispense with the pretense. I felt it. The fragment of me in your scar recognized itself in you. It's not yours anymore, Harry said. That fragment. It's been dissolving for 10 years. A pause. Show me your hands, Quirrell said. Why? Because the power I felt from you at the Quidditch match was not standard wizarding ability. I want to see the source. Harry looked at him. Then he held out both hands, relaxed, open, which was the most honest version of showing his hands available. Quirrell's eyes narrowed. He could see the dual systems in Harry because Voldemort's fragment could feel them, felt the seer and the wizarding magic both, the braided energy that produced something neither tradition generated alone. And the expression that moved across Quirrell's face, not through Quirrell's face, through whatever was behind it, was the expression Harry had been waiting for since September. Genuine surprise. What are you? It said. Harry said. Odinson. Also Potter, technically. What have they made you into? And the voice was darker now, more focused, the assessment sharpening. Asgardian seer and wizarding magic combined, those traditions have never, there is no precedent, no, Harry agreed. There isn't. Stand aside, Quirrell said. The stone. I have no quarrel with you tonight. You tried to kill me at the Quidditch match, Harry said. That was a test. A pause. A miscalculation. I understand that now. What do you understand now? Quirrell's eyes, Voldemort's eyes,
looked at him with an intelligence that was considerable and a perspective that was genuinely alien, the perspective of something that had spent decades in various stages of non-existence and had developed during that time a specific relationship to power and to death that had warped both. "I understand that you are not the boy I planned around," it said. "The prophecy spoke of a power I know not. I assumed that was sentiment. Love. An Asgardian upbringing changes the calculation." "It does," Harry said. "But the stone remains. And I require a body. And without it I remain, this." A gesture at Quirrell, at the diminishment. "You understand something about having a soul divided, don't you? You've been carrying a piece of me for 11 years. "I know," Harry said. "Then you know what it is to not be complete." Something moved in Quirrell's voice, not manipulation, or not only manipulation, something underneath it that was genuine. "Help me," it said. "Take the stone from the mirror. You're the only one who can." Harry looked at the mirror. Then he looked at Quirrell. Then he said, with the precision of someone being very specific, "No. You're choosing this. You're choosing to leave me. I'm choosing not to give you a body so you can continue doing what you've been doing," Harry said. "Those are different things." He looked at Quirrell steadily. "You're asking me to complete you. You killed my parents. Your parents chose to oppose me." "Yes," Harry said. "They did. Because what you believe and what you do are wrong." He kept his voice even. "Not in the way that people call things wrong when they mean inconvenient. Actually wrong. The belief that some people's lives are worth more than others because of how they were born is wrong, and the things that belief leads to are wrong, and I'm not going to help you get stronger." The chamber was very quiet. "Then we have nothing to negotiate," Quirrell said. "We don't," Harry said. Quirrell raised his wand. What he fired was not a stunning spell. It was a killing curse, vivid green, exactly the green of Harry's eyes, the green of his mother's eyes, the color that had carved the lightning bolt into his forehead 11 years ago. It crossed the chamber in the fraction of a second that curses travel at. Harry moved. Not out of the way, the curse was too fast for simple movement to cover the geometry. He moved and simultaneously put up the layered shield he'd been building in the background of this entire conversation, seer framework, wizarding force, the two systems working together the way they'd been training to work for 6 years, and the shield took the curse the way his skin had taken the embers in Godric's hollow when he was 11 months old. The curse broke. Not reflected, not redirected, it hit the shield and broke apart, the way it had broken apart against Lily's sacrifice 11 years ago, the same principle operating through different mechanics. The shield held because Harry was not afraid of death, and the killing curse fundamentally operated through the target's own fear, its own biological imperative to continue existing. A mind that held death as a fact rather than a terror experienced the curse differently. The broken curse scattered across the chamber in shards of light that faded immediately. Quirrell stared. "That's not possible," it said. Not Quirrell's voice at all anymore. The stutter was gone and so was any pretense of Quirrell, just Voldemort, looking out of a borrowed face, genuinely encountering something that disrupted his fundamental model of the world. "It's entirely possible," Harry said. "You're working from an incomplete understanding of what makes people powerful. You should be dead. I'm not. I was also not dead at 11 months old. You should probably update your model." He looked at Quirrell's face, at the thing behind Quirrell's face, with the particular compassion that was not the same thing as forgiveness, not a softening of his position, but an honest acknowledgement of what he was looking at. Tom Riddle made himself into this because he was afraid of being ordinary and being lost. I understand that fear is real. And what you built out of it is still wrong. The name landed in the chamber like a stone in water. Don't, it said, very quietly. Why not? It's your name. The fear of names is the fear of things having the size they actually are. Harry took 2 steps forward. Here's what's going to happen. I'm not going to let you have the stone. Dumbledore is on his way,
Hermione's very fast, and McGonagall can move when motivated. Quirrell needs help that I can't give him but someone can. He paused. And you need to understand that the prophecy, whatever it says, was describing a version of me that didn't exist. The version that does exist is not your weapon and not your victim. Quirrell's wand came up again. Another curse, not green this time, something darker, more complex, a curse that moved with the specific malice of something that wanted to do damage more sophisticated than death. Harry caught it on his wand. Not a shield this time, he pushed back, using the wand as a conductor, running both systems through it simultaneously, the Thunderbird feather responding to the dual input with the particular quality Harry had noticed since Ollivander's, both and more, and the resulting force traveled back along the curse's own connection the way lightning travels ground. The backlash hit Quirrell. Quirrell dropped. It was not elegant. It was the abrupt stopping of a moving thing, Quirrell's knees going and the floor meeting him and the sound of it hard in the stone chamber. Harry was beside him in 3 steps, hand on his wrist checking, alive, barely, the body desperately fragile in a way that only became visible now that its additional occupant had been disrupted. Quirrell, Harry said. Quirrell looked up at him. Just Quirrell now, the other presence retracted, compressed, gone back to whatever level of functioning was possible for something that had just had its current host rendered non-viable. The eyes were Quirrell's own, afraid, exhausted, old with what the shared occupancy had cost him. I didn't, Quirrell started. His voice was barely voice. I didn't have, he came to me when I was, I know, Harry said. You needed help and he offered the wrong kind and you took it and that was the trap. He looked at Quirrell steadily. That part's not simple to fix. But it's not over either. He'll come back. Not tonight. Not tonight, Harry said again, and his voice was the voice that Thor had used when Harry was small and afraid of things in the dark, not dismissive, not falsely reassuring, just completely present and completely certain, and that certainty was its own kind of comfort. Quirrell went still. His eyes closed. Harry sat back on his heels and looked at the mirror. He looked at himself in it, just himself, this time, no assembled family, just Harry standing in a dark stone chamber with a collapsed professor behind him and a mirror in front of him. He reached for the stone the way he'd reached for the snitch, not visually but with the wizarding magic, feeling for the enchantment, the specific signature of something that was both tremendously powerful and very small. He felt it respond, felt the mirror's enchantment engage, I show not your face but your heart's desire, and what the enchantment was designed to do was give the stone only to someone who wanted to find it but not to use it. Harry wanted to find it. He wanted it nowhere near Voldemort. He had no desire for the elixir of life, for immortality, for anything the stone could actually do. He'd grown up around people who had centuries behind them and it looked like enough time as it was. The stone appeared in his hand. Small. Red. Warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. He looked at it. Then he put it in his pocket, which was not perhaps what Dumbledore had planned would happen with it, but Dumbledore was on his way and could take it then, and in the meantime the floor of a stone chamber with Voldemort potentially still somewhere in the room's atmosphere was not a good place to leave something this significant. The chamber door opened. Dumbledore came through, and behind him McGonagall with her wand out, and behind her Snape, who looked at the scene, Quirrell on the floor, Harry standing in the middle of the chamber, the mirror standing untouched, with the expression of someone arriving at the end of an event they'd known was coming and finding it both what they expected and not. Dumbledore looked at Harry. He looked at Quirrell. He looked at the mirror. His eyes came back to Harry. The stone, he said. Harry reached into his pocket and held it out. Dumbledore took it. His hand, Harry noticed, was not quite steady as he closed his fingers around it, and he looked at Harry with something that had been recalibrating since the mirror room and was still going, a very good mind continuing to revise. Are you hurt? Dumbledore said. No. And Quirrell? Alive. He needs significant help. The occupancy cost him. Harry looked at his former professor on the floor. He wasn't a villain.
He was frightened and made a bad choice and paid for it. McGonagall was beside Quirrell with her wand working carefully through a diagnostic. Snape was looking at Harry with those dark eyes that were doing several things simultaneously: assessment, something older underneath it, something that involved the green eyes and the red hair of a woman who had been his friend a long time ago and who looked at him now through her son's face. "Mr. Odinson," Snape said. "Professor Snape," Harry said. A pause. "You're uninjured?" "Yes." Another pause. Snape's jaw worked slightly, and then he said, very quietly, with the quality of something said once and not to be repeated, "Your mother would have handled that differently." Harry looked at him. "Would she?" "She would have been angrier about it," Snape said. "She felt things loudly." He stopped. His expression did the complex thing it did when the layers were operating. "You feel things clearly." Harry held his gaze for a moment. "I'll take that," he said. Snape looked away. The professional mask settled back with the efficiency of long practice. He turned to assist McGonagall with Quirrell, and the conversation was over, but it had happened, and Harry filed it carefully where it belonged. Dumbledore was still looking at Harry. In his hand the stone was warm and red and real, and his expression was doing the most honest thing Harry had yet seen it do, which was simply being uncertain. "What do we do with Voldemort?" Dumbledore asked. Harry blinked. The question was direct. Unhedged. The voice of someone who had stopped planning around a person and started planning with one. "Not tonight," Harry said. "Tonight we make sure Quirrell gets care and the stone goes somewhere secure and Ron stops being concerned and Hermione stops catastrophizing, which at this point she's had 20 minutes to do, so it's going to be thorough." He looked at Dumbledore steadily. "And then we talk properly. About the Horcruxes. About what the plan actually needs to be. All of it." Dumbledore looked at him for a moment. Then he did something Harry had not seen from him directed at a student. He nodded. Not the pedagogical nod, not the wise old headmaster nod. A nod between equals. "Tomorrow," Dumbledore said. "Tomorrow," Harry agreed. He turned and walked toward the door, back the way he'd come, up through the obstacles, and the chess pieces, magically reset, moved aside for him without prompting, which was either Dumbledore's magic from somewhere behind him or the castle's own acknowledgement, and Harry didn't bother to determine which because both were equally fine. He went to find his friends. Ron was on the right side of the chessboard's door when Harry came through, sitting against the wall with a mild lump on his head and an expression of someone who had been trying to calculate probabilities and had settled on confident optimism as the more productive position. "Well?" Ron said. "Handled," Harry said. "And Hermione's?" "Probably already at the hospital wing organizing everyone." "Are you all right?" Harry stopped. He thought about it honestly, the way he did things honestly. He thought about Quirrell on the floor and Voldemort's voice saying I didn't have a choice and the stone in his hand, warm and small, and the mirror showing him just himself, whole, complete, exactly where he was supposed to be. "Yes," he said. And it was true. Ron looked at him for a moment. "Did you actually, in there, yes?" "And it was, a problem with a shape," Harry said. "I knew the shape." Ron absorbed this. Then he put his hand out, not the warrior clasp Harry had grown up with in Asgard, but the simple Gryffindor at midnight gesture of a friend who has been waiting and is very glad the waiting is over, and Harry took it and pulled him to his feet and they walked back up through the trapdoor and through the door and into the ordinary darkness of Hogwarts at night. "Hermione's going to want every detail," Ron said. "I know," Harry said. "She's going to want to write a report." "I know." "She's been very patient," Ron said, "for someone who has not had an update in 45 minutes. "She's going to be fine," Harry said. "She was handling Fluffy when I came through." Ron blinked. She was handling, the harp had stopped. She was singing to him. A pause. Hermione was singing to the three-headed dog, Ron said, in the voice of someone building a memory. "Off-key," Harry said,
but effectively. Ron started laughing, the real laugh, the one that had no self-consciousness in it because there was no audience he was performing for, just Harry in the dark corridor and the genuine ridiculousness of the evening, and Harry laughed with him, and the castle was quiet around them, and somewhere up through the floors and the enchanted ceiling the Scottish night was doing its usual things, cold and clear and immense. They walked together back toward Gryffindor Tower,